If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this. People, what are your scariest sightings with the paranormal and supernatural, such as shadows, tall dark figures, demons, and other dark entities, that made you believe? 10 years ago, I went to the Montparnasse cemetery in Paris to see Baudelaire's grave with my mom and my friend. I decided to take a walk alone on a path near the street and admire the architecture. 20 minutes later, I was calling my friend and told him that I would go back to our car and wait for them there, and as I was just saying that, a woman dressed in black walked on the path in the opposite direction, pushing a loud cart. I stood up still and continued my phone call, but then, she literally disappeared behind a goddamn grave while casually walking. Blinked 10 times and run out of the cemetery like Forrest Gump. I still don't know what I saw. I was taking EVPs out in a rural abandoned cemetery with a friend at the time. This cemetery dates from the late 1700s to the mid-1800s. It was lost in a cornfield for decades and was just cleaned up and reclaimed in the last 20 years. It's a very personable place, mostly peaceful but eerie. Something a bit mean is hanging around there, I think. I have a few stories from that place in particular. Once I was standing near the entrance to the graveyard and getting ready to go in, when suddenly I felt a terrible searing pain in the middle of my back, about 2 inches under my shoulder blades. It was bad enough to make me jump and yell. I thought something had bitten me. I rubbed at the spot as best I could and just carried on with what I was doing, but the pain wouldn't go away. I finally called my friend over to take a look at the spot, just to make sure it wasn't a spider bite or an actual wound. He lifted my shirt and peered at the spot, touched it, and said, "It's kind of dry, like a burn. It looks like a cigarette burn." That was it. That was just what it felt like, too. We got out of there pretty quick that night. It killed the woo-woo mood pretty fast. When I got home, I looked at it in the mirror, and I'd be ducked if it wasn't a cigarette burn, a brown little crusty round wound in the middle of my back. What a bastard ghost. So all throughout my life, I've had weird encounters with the unknown, but this one was one of the scariest encounters of all. I was visiting my cousin for a night of video games, and Yu-Gi-Oh! It was near 10 p.m., so I decided to smoke a cigarette. He joined me outside his back porch area to chat, and while he was talking to me, I felt compelled to look to the left, and that's when I felt something was moving over the ledge. It had a weird aura and presence about it, but it was like it was ignoring me or did not notice me because it continued to move along the top of the ledge in a direction where eventually it would reach the opposite stairs and the path to the neighbor's north, but that's when it just stopped. It just stopped and turned itself directly facing me. I could immediately tell it was looking at me and just looked back. I was able to get a clear view of it. It was still a dark figure, but it had to be at least 8 to 9 tall. I don't know how long it was, but then suddenly my cousin said, "Hey, oh my God, what is that? We need to get out of here." As he opened the door to the house, my cousin is a big dude and is not frightened, hardly ever. I kept looking at it, backing up, until finally shutting the door. My cousin and I were in complete shock, but he went to grab his firearms. We waited and turned the lights off, eventually going to bed with no other problems. Last night, I had the scariest paranormal encounter. It started when I woke up for no apparent reason. I don't usually wake up in the middle of the night, but last night I did. While I was awake, I heard heavy breathing behind me on the other side of my bed. I sleep in a queen by myself. It was so close, in fact, that it was right up against my neck. I refused to turn around because I was scared of what I was going to see, so I decided to grab my sister's bed light and turn it on, which made the breathing stop. Important side note. One of the last owners of the house died in a paddock right outside the building. I'm not too sure how he died, but I heard it was a gruesome one. My sighting of the unexplained figure was around 18 years ago, in the early 2000s. I would have been 9 or 10, and my cousin, who was with me, is a year younger. My cousin Dan and I were sitting in my bedroom right before it was time to go to sleep, and we were horsing around, wrestling under the covers, etc. For some reason, I just felt this pit form in the bottom of my stomach and felt like something was watching me. As I look up, my cousin's face expresses exactly what I'm feeling. We lift the covers and look to the hallway, where my bedroom door is, and bam, there it is. This man, I assume, is without skin, just muscle, even the face. Its eyes were pure red. It stood there staring at us from the hallway for a good 5 to 10 seconds, smiling, before we decided to go back into the child-safe zone under the blankets. After a few minutes, we peeked out, and it was gone. We never spoke of this incident until recently. He described what he saw to a T of what I had seen. That's how I know it wasn't just crazy child fantasy. So my question is, does anyone know what we saw? Was this some kind of demonic presence? When I was 11, I was at my sister's house. It was the middle of the night, and I was asleep. I'm a light sleeper, though, and I felt this pressure on the end of the bed like someone had just sat down. I open my eyes and see there is an alien sitting on the end of my bed staring at me. I felt frozen and cold, and I shut my eyes straight away. Then I half opened my eyes, squinting through my eyelashes, and I saw he's still there, just staring at me. I notice he has huge black eyes and a huge pale head, what I know now to be a typical gray. I couldn't make out nostrils, but there was a very small line to indicate a mouth, but that's hazy too in my memory. He has a black jumpsuit that encloses his feet, the suit body stops at his wrists and neck. He sits there for a bit, just observing me, I have no idea for how long. I know he knew I was awake, I don't know how or why I know, but I do. I didn't feel threatened, I just knew he wasn't going to do anything. Then, after some time, he gets up quickly and exits through the doorway, and I realize he is huge. Taller than the doorframe, so maybe 7 feet tall? I stay frozen, count to 30, and then race to the lounge where my sisters were sleeping and sleep with them. This encounter is the most clear and true in my mind. I do have 2 others, but because I was playing video games like Abe's Odyssey at the time, I give favor to one's childish imagination and tend to discount them. But this particular encounter changed the course of my life forever. I often wonder why he wanted me to know he was there. Clearly, they don't have to be seen if they don't want to. When I was around 8 to 9 years old, my father dropped my older brothers, younger sister, and me off at my grandparents' house. My grandparents live out in the country in a sort of cottage on a farm. I was out in the barn with the newborn calves when I felt something hit my arm. I looked down and noticed a dark red substance. Instinctively, I looked up, and to my surprise, there was a chicken hanging on a wire from the barn beams. I freaked out and ran into the house looking for my brothers since my grandparents were out in the field baling hay at the time. They didn't believe me when I told them what I saw, so they went to see for themselves. When they came back from the barn, they said that there was nothing there. The next morning, when I woke up, we went downstairs to eat breakfast. I guess my grandparents noticed that I kept itching my back and sides. They made me lift my shirt to see if I had a rash, which is pretty normal since there's a lot of poison ivy around their house and the barn. I remember my grandmother yelling something at my grandfather, and my brothers looked quite disturbed. Apparently there were handprints on my torso, lower back, and shoulder blade. For the next few days, my little sister had been exhibiting some pretty similar things, but some of them were a little worse. And by a little worse, I mean things like dead birds being dropped at the end of her bed or books falling off her shelf. Only once was there an incident where she was injured. It was when she was working on her journaling at her desk and she found a note in her journal. I don't remember what the note said, though. When she woke up the next morning, that's when it happened. I didn't see any of it before she got in the shower and washed off, but my grandma and oldest brother did. They said it looked like someone took a pencil or needle and poked holes in her hands, and that they were covered in blood. Nothing else has happened to us since then, but it's still a terrifying memory. I could shit myself just thinking about it. This happened like 3 or 4 years ago, but I still remember all the details. It freaked me out so bad. Me and my brother had decided to sleep on our mattresses in our back lounge room, basically a sleepover but with a sibling. However, when we actually went to sleep, he changed his mind and went back to his room. Keep in mind he was like 9 and wasn't really used to it. I chose to stay instead of going back, but I ended up not being able to sleep. At the time, washing had recently been done, so there were a bunch of baskets sitting out there. For context, our back lounge room directly connects to our dining room, basically, one huge room split into 2. The baskets were in the dining room section, aka directly behind my head. I turned my head around to look back at the baskets and saw this black shadow crawl on all 4s from behind one basket to another. It was like 1 to 2 a.m. when this happened, so nobody else was awake. I was scared out of my mind and probably only went to sleep when it was around 5 in the morning. I have no idea what that thing was, but I was too scared to check if something was actually there, so I don't have a way to confirm it. My parents' house was built in 1928 in an area of California that had a lot of history during Spanish Catholic mission times. They had been living in the house for maybe 5 or so years, and my brother would always say he would see a figure in various spots of the house before he moved out, and every time he visited, he saw it. My mom also believes the house is haunted and has experienced odd things like watching a light in another room turn on by itself. One of the recessed floor vents for the heating was pulled out and turned 60 degrees from the hole it sits in when they left home and came back. Everyone in my family has seen or experienced something odd in that house, with my brother having the most out of everyone. One summer, my brother and I surprised them on Father's Day. The day after we arrived, I woke up early, at about 7 a.m., to go to the gym, and as I was getting ready in the bathroom, I heard what sounded like my dad's voice calling my name in a half-whispering volume from the kitchen about 20 feet away. I respond back with the same tone, saying yeah? And I get no return. I go out of the bathroom, into the kitchen, and check all the adjacent rooms. No one else is awake, their bedroom door was still closed, as was my brother's. I was the only soul awake in the house, and that's the only unexplained experience I've ever had in that house and in my life. A final story, my father was raised as a heavily Protestant Christian. Anything such as ghosts, supernatural, all that jazz he was taught was demons from hell. The only ghost is the Holy Ghost. One day he was going to work and got a text from my mom saying that she forgot to let one of our cats back in the house and asked if he could let him in. He whips around, heads home, and opens the door to the backyard. Off to the right is the door to a root cellar. He sees the cat, named Pete, all black fur and 25 pounds, on top of the door, his fur standing up and meanly mugging towards the garage in the backyard. My dad looks over, and he says he saw another cat, but it was more than double the size of Pete. And what really set him off was that he said it had a human face. He said it looked at him like it wasn't afraid of my dad being there, and it just casually walked between the fence and the garage and was gone. Every time we mention it, he never wants to talk about it in depth at all. He always says, "It was a big cat with a human face, I didn't like it." This was about 11 years ago, I was 17 at the time. This also took place in Finland a little after midnight. I can't remember what month it took place, but it was dark, so it could have been in the spring or winter. I also want to mention that I lived in an apartment where my room was on the 3rd floor. My room had a huge window that had access to the roof. I was messaging a friend when I heard what I thought was a mope driving by, so of course I ignored it. I remember feeling this fear wash over me, and the feeling wouldn't go away. I had this feeling for a couple of days before the encounter. I heard the moped again, but this time I realized it wasn't a moped. It sounded like a man's voice but was not fully human. The sound got closer and sounded like it was saying ah, like ghostly and chilling. I was still messaging my friend when the sound reached my window. I see that out of the corner of my eye, there was a pale, faceless creature that appeared at my window. I quickly messaged my friend that I had to go. I was too scared to stay there, so I ran out of my room to my mother's room. She was mostly asleep when I told her I saw something scary at my window. So I don't think it registered with her. I crawled under her blankets and felt something tap my nose. I was too scared to look. I had other encounters, but this was the scariest, and I still have no idea what it was. Ever since this encounter, my bedroom has always had curtains, so I don't see what's outside. When I was around 7 or 8, my family lived in a small home where I could see the front door leading into the living room from the kitchen. I was in the kitchen one afternoon, getting something, I don't remember exactly what, when I heard the front door open. I remember looking at the clock and seeing that it was way too early for my dad to be getting home from work, and my mom was staying at home. She was folding laundry in her room. Anyway, I remember being happy because my dad was home early. Maybe we could play soccer in the backyard or go hiking in the woods behind our house. But what walked through the door, I'll never forget. It was shaped like my dad and dressed like him, but the colors were wrong. His skin was purple in some places and blue in others. His eyes were bright green with orange around them. His clothes were all kinds of different colors. I remember freezing, then diving down to the floor behind an island. I remember hearing its footsteps stop, then continue through the house. After a while, I finally ran to my mom and cried, telling her something was wrong with my dad and trying to explain what I saw. I know it wasn't a dream because I remember hitting the floor so hard that I bruised my knee when I dove to hide. I didn't stop crying until my real dad got home and I could tell him about it, then I wouldn't leave his side for the rest of the night. He died about a year or so later from complications from being an alcoholic. While he was in the hospital with his liver and other organs shutting down, he tried to get out of bed and fell, bruising the side of his face. So between the jaundice and giant purple bruise, and obviously the fact I knew he was dying, the memory of whatever I saw coming through the front door has freaked me the hell out. Still does 30 years later. I was in bed, asleep. The time had to be somewhere around 3 a.m. I awoke with a bright red light shining into my bedroom window. I thought that something had happened outside. I thought that it was either a fire or emergency lights from a vehicle. When I got up to open my curtain to look outside, the light completely went away as soon as I opened the curtains. I also remember it being a little windy. I thought it was weird, and it took about a minute for me to take it in that a light so bright could go away in a matter of seconds. As soon as I closed the curtains back up and turned to lay back down, there was a man standing by my bed. This wasn't any ordinary man. This man was very tall and dressed in black. I don't know if they were regular clothes, but I do know that he was covered in black all the way up to his neck. But what I'm about to say is what scared me. He had pale, almost white skin. Whether it was skin or not is the question, and he didn't have any hair anywhere on his head or his face. Let me change that. He didn't have a face. That's what frightened me. He didn't have a face. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. I started to scream, but it was as if I had become mute. I knew my mouth was open, and I was trying with all my might to scream, but nothing would come out. He just stood there and looked at me. I also recall not being able to move. I don't remember what happened after that. I only remember waking up in the morning and not being able to breathe through my nostrils, as if I had a very bad case of sinuses. After that night, I continued to have dreams of a ship hovering in my backyard, and as it hovered, it had a sucking action, and my dreams would be of me always trying to hold on so that it wouldn't pull me in. The dreams never stopped. And on another occasion after that night, my boyfriend and I were sitting out in the street in his car, and all we saw was a bright light over our car. We thought that it was a helicopter that had its spotlight on us, but there was no noise that a helicopter makes. It shined on us for about a minute, then when it stopped, we looked out the window towards the sky, and all we saw was this huge strike of fire going slowly towards the east, but the fire wasn't red, it was green. The car wouldn't start afterwards. And I did come inside and call a news station, but I don't remember what news channel it was, but I remember them telling me that they did have numerous other calls about seeing something in the sky at the same moment that we had that experience. And the next morning, I went outside and noticed that the car was completely drained of oil. We never told anyone else. When I was younger and at a sleepover for a friend's birthday, we saw something I have no explanation for. We were sleeping outside in tents and just bullshitting after dark. My friend was into motocross and had several dirt jumps in his yard that led into a tree line and through the woods a bit. Anyway, it was dark, and we're sitting there, and I looked down, and in front of the opening to the tree line in front of one of the jumps, there was I guess shimmering would be the closest descriptor I could use, large ball about the size of a large beach ball hovering there. It wasn't exactly transparent, but I guess it was very light, pearlescent, and changing colors. Everyone who was still awake witnessed this. We were all in awe and scared at the same time. Two of my friends were brave enough to go close to it and stood there briefly before running back in tears and actually ending up going home, which was extremely uncharacteristic for one of them. We watched it for a while longer, and it hovered higher and eventually moved into the woods. After that, we all went and abandoned tents and slept in the house. It felt so otherworldly, and I've never seen anything else that can compare. In my childhood home, there were always strange vibes in the basement. For the longest time, it was just off feelings and occasional odd sounds. If I ever brought it up to my father, a total skeptic, he would shrug it off and say that there was nothing to be afraid of down there. Well, my parents began to remodel or finish the basement when I was about 9 or 10, and at this time, the basement had also become where I spent a lot of my time since my N64 was hooked up down there. I was up late one night playing N64 when the energy in the main living area absolutely flipped. It was heavy. Or oppressive, maybe? I'm not sure how to describe it, but it was noticeable enough for me to press pause on my game and listen or observe. After a few moments, I managed to convince myself that it was nothing, and just as I was about to hit pause and get back to my game, I heard a woman's voice clear as day in a sing-song voice say, "Hello?" This scared me so bad that I frantically bolted up the stairs as quickly as I could, yelling for my parents. Once they calmed me down, my father went downstairs to look around. At first, he thought it could be an intruder, but as he looked all around, inside and outside, the house decided that it was either the pipes making funny noises or just my imagination. It took me a while, but I eventually accepted this explanation too and, after a few months, finally got the guts to continue hanging out down there. Well, one night a few months later, I am once again up late playing Vidya when the same feeling comes over the living area. This startles me, and I get up and start walking toward the stairs, knowing what happened last time, and just as I take my first step up, the very same voice, now louder and right behind me, says, "Hello." Same deal, I frantically bolt up the stairs. My parents calm me down, take a look, and find nothing. This was the last time I spent time down there by myself until I was much older. Once the renovations were done, I don't think I really experienced anything else down there other than the occasional bad or weird feeling. Years later, I'm talking about this with my mom, and she was like, "Oh yeah, I hated that basement. Bad feelings down there. Didn't you ever notice that Shasta, the family dog, never went down there? Also, I swear I would see silhouettes of people walking past the base of the staircase at times. Your father never believed me, but we always told you it was nothing, so you wouldn't be scared. Wow, thanks a lot, Mom and Dad, for just letting me hang out in a haunted basement. I've had quite a few. I'm positive that my parents' property is haunted. There was this one time I had a couple of friends over. It was towards the end of summer and the beginning of fall. School was starting shortly, we were going into 6th grade. We were going to sleep in a tent in the yard. A little backstory, my parents bought the house next to us and tore it down, so we had a pretty nice sized yard. We also inherited a light pole with the street light pointing in towards the yard rather than the street, with the property. So, anyway, we were goofing around as young men do all day, and at night we are in the tent still messing around. Then we see a shadow. I said, it's probably someone walking down the street because the light points in. But the shadow was getting closer. Then I thought, hey, it's my dad coming out here to try and scare us. Then we realized there was no sound from the steps. Like, we would hear my dad walking, stepping on leaves, and things like that. My dad is a lot of things, but being discreet is not one of them. As the shadow got to the tent, we were freaking the hell out. Then, the shadow started to walk around the tent and then became 3 shadows. They were just silently walking around the tent. Scared out of our minds, I screamed, "Who's out there?" The shadows stopped. There was no response, but we could still see the shadows. I grabbed the zipper, looked at my friends, and they looked back like they were up to whatever I had in mind. So, I started counting down from 3, I hit 1, unzipped that tent faster than I ever have, the 3 of us jumped out, and no one was there. Now, when I said 1 and unzipped the tent, we could still see the shadows. There's no way that 1, let alone 3, people can just disappear that fast in my yard. We would have seen and or heard them. We definitely would have seen them. We went in and slept in my room. I still occasionally talk with one of the guys who were there that night. I asked him about 5 months ago if he remembered that night. I don't think putting his exact response here would be appropriate, but yes, he remembers. 3 or 4 years ago, when I still lived in my old apartment, there were 2 mirrors facing each other in the hallway. They were pretty close. One day, when me and my ex were about to go shopping, I turned towards the bigger mirror, and I saw a full shadow man in the mirror. It was standing the closest to me. He bowed his head to the side, waved at me, and then ran into the bigger bedroom. I yelled out for my ex to come to me as fast as possible. He ran to me, and I told him what I saw. He had a good laugh because, at that point in time, he didn't believe in these things. A few weeks later, I was in the bigger bedroom when I heard my ex yell my name in fear. I ran to him. He was standing in front of the bigger mirror, he was pale as a ghost. I knew he saw the shadow man. After that, he slowly started believing in the paranormal. A year later, I saw the shadow man in the mirror again. It was standing so close to the mirror that I could barely see any reflection from it. Once again, he bobbed his head to the side, waved, and then ran into the bigger bedroom. After that, we put a towel on the other mirror because we'd had nowhere else to put it, and after that, we hadn't seen the shadow man in the mirror. When I was 9 years old, my whole family decided to sleep together in the living room because we wanted to watch a late-night TV program. I suddenly woke up in the middle of the night, and in the corner of my eye, I could see Mom sitting in the adjacent room, brushing her long hair. All the lights in the house were off, so I thought to myself, what is Mom doing brushing her hair in the dark? A few seconds later, to my horror, I saw that my mom was still asleep, right next to me. I also just realized one major detail: Mom's hair was short. I looked at the figure again, and she was still there. From where I was, all I could see was her back sitting on the sofa. I immediately hid under my blanket, my whole body shivering and trembling for what felt like forever until I fell back asleep. I told everybody in the morning, but nobody believed me. To this day, I still remember that figure. I tried to convince myself I was dreaming, but no, it was very, very real. I live in a rural shepherd's cottage. Partner was away. No animals in the home paddock, no easy or sneaky way for people to get close to the house. All night after I went to bed, I heard footsteps on the wraparound deck. Every time the slow, heavy, and measured steps came near the bedroom, the cats freaked right out. Typically, cell reception was down that night. Next morning, there was a deep frost and not a footstep or sign of disturbance in the ice on the deck. At another house, I got visited by a spirit in the laundry. In midsummer, the air went freezing cold. I turned to see a smudgy human shape with dark hair, pale skin, a red and white striped top, and tan pants. They passed through the wall from inside the house, through the laundry, and out the back wall. The landlord assured me that the previous tenant didn't die there. A week after my cat died, I walked out the back door to see her sitting in her spot on the wheelie bin. My partner saw her, too. We went inside and cried. Around 7 years ago, when I was staying at my dad's house, I woke up in the middle of the night to see what I now believe was a leprechaun. I know that sounds absolutely ridiculous, but this experience was so creepy that it still gives me chills to this day. I grew up in my dad's house, and it's always felt like home. It doesn't have any creepy vibes or a history of paranormal activity. It's just a normal house. I was sleeping in my bedroom, and I woke up facing the left side of the room. In the space about 1.5 meters in front of me, I saw this small man, maybe 3 feet tall, dancing in a circle. Since I'd just woken up, my eyes weren't fully adjusted, so I could only make out the outline of this thing and couldn't see any facial features. I hope this makes sense, but it wasn't a shadowy being, it was a solid mass, as real as a person standing in the room. He was wearing a top hat, and the dancing was really strange. The dancing is hard to describe. The only way I can think of explaining it is that he was hunched over, doing an exaggerated tiptoeing motion. Anyway, I've been watching it dance for around 10 seconds, which doesn't sound like a long time, but it was enough time for me to properly wake up and wonder what on earth I was looking at. I was shocked and frozen, thinking this couldn't be real. After watching it dance in this short space of time, it suddenly stops dead in its tracks, seems to turn around towards me, and begins coming at me with speed. I screamed and flipped to the other side of the bed to turn the light on. When I looked back to the side of the room where it had been, it was gone. Needless to say, I kept the light on and didn't go to sleep again until it was light outside and my dad was awake. For a long time, I explained this apparition as a creepy small man dancing around my room in a top hat. It wasn't until I told my boyfriend about it years later, and he said it sounded like a leprechaun, that it clicked. What do you think it might have been? In terms of a rational explanation, I guess it could have just been a waking hallucination or an overspill from a dream. However, I've had several instances throughout my life of waking up in the night and seeing apparitions. This experience, along with one other, has been the only one that has felt different from those other times. It's not like I saw it briefly or as a quick flash, I had time to watch it and take it in. I was fully awake by the time it started to rush toward me. I struggle to explain it away, and it still freaks me out whenever I think about it. I've had quite a few, and granted, maybe this isn't my scariest or even my most supernatural, but it's definitely one of the ones that messed me up the most. I had a dream about a woman getting possessed. It was extremely detailed down to the point where I still remember what her screams sounded like, and a lot of those screams and screaming words were directed at me, her going between standing 10 feet to 3 inches away from my face still screaming, what her dress and hair looked like, what lights she owned, what the stairs in her house looked like, what it smelled like, etc. It messed me up pretty badly. I woke up yelling and crying, and I had to wake my parents up because I was legitimately just completely out of whack and freaking the absolute duck out. The next day, the day of my nightmare, my mother had been reading a true story about this woman who was possessed. She stopped because she claimed she was just getting very bad vibes. She asked me for the details, and I gave them. They matched. Somehow this woman's possession worked itself into my dreams without me ever having to know about it, with me seeing details that were only mentioned written down. My mother isn't extremely religious, but she immediately bought me a few protective things. I guess after hearing that a woman possessed by a demon screamed in your kids' faces for an hour, it kind of brought out the religious side of you. After that, I couldn't watch scary movies with possession in them for a long time because it would trigger a panic attack at the memory of the dream. I have had a problem with sleep paralysis for as long as I can remember. It seems to get worse during times of stress, but I usually don't go more than 6 months without an episode, and they tend to happen in clusters. This particular episode happened around 4 years ago, and it has always unsettled me. Basically, this happened during a time when I was in the middle of a cluster of episodes, but this was the only time I've seen this particular thing. I decided to take a nap around midday on my couch. I was situated so that I wasn't quite facing my living room, but I could see it if I moved my eyes. I fell asleep and suddenly woke up, not being able to move anything other than my eyes and feeling like I was pushing against my mind while trying to wake up. The best way I know how to describe it is like I'm in really deep water trying to swim to the surface, but there's a current going against me. This is all fairly standard sleep paralysis stuff for me, but what I saw is not. I became aware of something looking at me. I moved my eyes to the far end of the couch, and there was something there, a few feet past the end of my couch. The creature was a light gray humanoid with long, spindly limbs. It was hairless and crouched so that its knees were more or less by its ears. It was gaunt to the point where I could see its bones through its body. I thought that it was maybe spiky as well, like at its elbows, etc. I can't remember its face anymore, and I would be afraid to come up with something in case my memory was influenced by something else. I remember this feeling of deep dread, especially because I was essentially helpless. Worse, I was in and out of consciousness, and every time I woke up again, I was still paralyzed, but it was closer. I tried to scream or move away, but I was absolutely powerless to do anything except stare at it. Then, just like that, it was gone, and I woke up for real and could move. I was shaken up but otherwise fine, and as time went by, I wrote it off as a bad dream. Still, whenever I thought about it, I had a lump in my chest and felt just disturbed. There was a feeling of plain wrongness about this thing. Eventually, I mostly forgot about it, until now. When I read about crawlers, they sound extremely similar to what I saw and make it a lot harder for me to blow it off. I had never heard of them before and had no idea they existed before this point or that anyone else had ever seen anything like what I saw. The only thing that doesn't fit is that I haven't heard of them, in my few hours of research, being associated with sleep paralysis, and it seems like they're mostly seen outdoors. Mine was inside my apartment in the middle of a fairly big city. Does anyone know if what I saw fits? If it wasn't a crawler, could it have been something else? It's a lot harder for me to put this back into the box knowing that people have seen something damn similar to this. A few years ago, my ex-boyfriend's best friend bought a house, and we all moved in together, plus my dog. I tell this story all the time, and I don't honestly care if people believe me or not. Sometimes, thinking back, I even ask myself, was that real? But it was. It started out small, like every once in a while I'd get this twinge of fear or discomfort when I was alone in the house. Then I started noticing my dog refused to go in the basement. Refused. The basement was unfinished and had rough walls and dirt floors in some parts because the house was just old. That's where the laundry was. I noticed she would follow me to the first landing on the stairs and then sit or lie there watching me, but she would not, for the life of her, come down. I even tried feeding her down there once, coaxing her with treats, but nothing. One afternoon, my roommate and I were watching TV in the living room. And I started hearing some sounds like doors moving or floorboards creaking, and they just didn't sound right, but that's crazy, right? So I didn't say anything. Eventually my roommate muted the TV and asked, "Are you hearing that?" It sounded so distinctly like there was a person in the house with us that when we went upstairs to look, he dead-ass stopped me on the stairs and said to me, "I just want you to know I have a gun in the house." Nothing there. After a few weeks, that feeling of discomfort when alone in the house was very, very palpable. It was just so uncomfortable to be there alone. One afternoon, again, I was sitting in the living room watching TV, except this time I was alone with my dog. The staircase is to my right. My dog suddenly jumps up and looks right up the stairs, like she sees something. She starts barking, and I try to quiet her. She calms down for a second but then keeps getting up and barking, staring up the stairs, walking up to the bottom of the stairs, and then backing away and growling. She's freaking me out. The duck. Out. My heart is fully pounding, and I need her to stop. So I figure I will take her upstairs and show her there is nothing there, so she calms down because there's nothing there, right? Because I'm alone in the house? So I kind of gently guided her up the stairs, and sure enough, nothing was there. I decide I might as well tidy my room while I'm up here, so I walk to the end of the hall and flip on the light to my room, and the light bulb pops, sparks, and goes the duck out. So at this point, I'm like, okay. Either there is something here and you can run away in fear, there is something here and you can stay and show you aren't afraid, or you can calm the duck down and stop being jumpy because this is just a weird coincidence. So I decided to stay. I walk across the room and start making the bed when my pineal gland just starts screaming at me that there is something in the room with me. And the hair on the back of my neck rises, and my dog starts to growl. And the blinds to my right snap up and start spinning. I SHT you not. I dropped everything, turned around, grabbed my dog and my bag, and ran out of the house. I did not come back until everyone else was home. But that's not even the worst. A few weeks later, I woke up dreaming in the middle of the night, sort of floating somewhere between awake and asleep, and in this lucid dream I think I'm having, a man in a suit comes out of the closet, walks across the room, and leans down over my ex-boyfriend's head like he is going to whisper something in his ear. In real life, my ex-boyfriend rolls over, pushes me a little, and says, "Baby, stop wiping stuff on my face." The next morning, when we woke up, my ex said he had a strange lucid dream where someone came out of the closet and whispered in his ear, "Are you happy now? Say what you will." But this SHT happened. It was a dark period in my life and my ex's, and I truly think that something in that house fed off of all the pain and anger in us both that we were carrying around, And I think that genuinely gave whatever was there enough of its own energy to actually manifest itself. We moved. The house I just sold was haunted. It stared off at first, making little noises followed by footsteps. They were easily written off as house sounds. We started to hear voices in the rooms we weren't in. They were not always understandable, but you could tell they were voices. Our friends knew nothing about it, but one night while we were playing a board game, they told us how our house made them feel like they were being watched. We started to ask questions when my then 4-year-old told us about the black lady and the man with the smile who would stand outside his bedroom door at night. He would scream at them to go away. We started calling the presence Wanda. I'm not sure why, but I think it was just to put us more at ease. Wanda decided she liked the attention and would act out more and more, throwing things, moving objects, opening the kitchen cabinets, and finally touching us. We decided enough was enough, and we started ignoring her. We told her to get out. It was quiet for a few weeks, and then she came back one night before we moved. She grabbed my wife while she was lying in bed. We moved 2 weeks later and haven't looked back. I do not miss Wanda. I moved out of my parents' house when I was 19 to live with a longtime friend of mine. He knew things were pretty rough for me there, so he offered me a room. Now, having been his friend for a while, I had been at his place a lot. Through the years, I had a lot of uncomfortable experiences there, but I mostly shook them off as anxiety. An important detail to add is that his parents were going through a pretty nasty divorce after years of a worsening marriage, so the place just had a really bad energy to it. At this point, his mother had moved out, and his younger siblings were with her every other week. His father traveled for business on those off weeks, and well, my friend went off to college. So I was alone in a fairly large house pretty regularly. I heard cracks and bangs throughout most nights, but I always thought of them as just house noises. Now we are going to skip ahead by about a year. It was just my friend and me living in the house now. His father got a new place, so the house was pretty bare, minus boxes and general disarray. The house noise had become louder and almost more aggressive. My friend and I had kind of just gotten used to them. One night I had a girl staying over, and my perspective on everything changed. It was about 3 a.m., and the house was silent. Completely silent. It was terrifying in its own way. The next night, when she was gone, the noises resumed. I knew at that point something was making the noises. I am going to make one final jump ahead here to the last night I had been living there. My friend had moved out a few weeks ago, and I was about to leave. In the few weeks I was alone, though, I started feeling terrible. Every time I walked into that house, I started feeling weak, as if my life had been drained from me. The last night was the worst experience of my life. I was lying in bed with my headphones, listening to some music to help me fall asleep. As I started to nod off, the house noises started, and they started loud. It blocked out the sound of my music, and I felt paralyzed. At that moment, I could see out of the corner of my eye that another door had been opened. I saw a dark figure appear in the doorway. I couldn't breathe. It glided over to me. All of a sudden, I felt an icy hand on my back. My body was instantly frozen. I felt this hand push through me and grasp my heart. I thought I was about to die. I managed to gasp for air, and at that moment, it was over. The noise was gone, and my door was shut. I immediately went and sat in my car for the night and did not sleep. This was my mother's. She has no reason to lie, and it's the only ghost story she's ever told. She got into family history. One night, my dad is away for a night, so she's home alone. She starts in on reading a diary she's obtained, which belonged to my dad's mother, an intensely private woman who passed away 20 years ago. It starts to rain outside. She closes the windows of her study and keeps reading. Then it starts really coming down, to the point where it becomes distracting. She kind of glances around a bit, then goes back to reading. Now, they live in a really large house, and a previous owner put an intercom system in with a unit in every room. Suddenly, the intercom in her study starts blasting a static noise at full volume. She gets up, crosses the room, and turns the volume down, revealing that all the intercoms in all the rooms are doing the same thing. She goes down to the master unit in the kitchen and kills it somehow. That's when she notices that all the pictures on the wall are taken at the same angle. That's when what she described as kind of like a gust of wind rattled the balcony glass doors and windows, which run along the entire second level of the house from one end to the other. Instead of noping out of there, she returns to the study, closes the diary, says, "Sorry, Nan," to the ceiling, and puts the book in a cupboard. The storm fades and stops. Nothing else happens. The footnote is what trips me out most. By coincidence, someone from her work lives on the same street, I'm going to say a maximum of 20 houses away. They're near the water, but it's a typical suburban street, they're not on sheer cliffs or anything. Anyway, she's at work the next day and says something like, "So, how about that storm last night?" And the guy is like, "What storm?" Apparently they had dinner out on their balcony and never got a drop of rain. This happened years ago, when I was about 9 or 10, I'm 27 now. My family used to live on a government-owned goat farm. It's a thing in my country in Southeast Asia, not sure anywhere else, as a caretaker and vet for the goats they kept there. The area is pretty huge, and the only way in or out is through a lone road with a steel double gate, usually locked at night until morning to keep intruders out. The place is a government area. Also, it is pretty secluded, only 2 families live there, and comprised mostly of thick forest. One night, my family, mom, dad, and older sister, and I were in our car on our way home from a prayer meeting at church. It was around 11 p.m. at the time. As per usual practice, my dad stopped his car just after the metal gate and got out to lock it. At this time, my mom, sister, and I were in the car minding our business. That's when I noticed a strange ball of light floating straight ahead on the dark road, just slightly beyond where the car headlight reaches. If I remember correctly, the size was a bit smaller than a football. I quickly told my mom and sister, and they were equally puzzled. My dad came and saw it as well. It just floats there while we are watching. After a while, it moves closer to the ground before vanishing without trace. Not a trace of anything was there when we drove on. We told a few of the workers at the farm about our experience that night, but most of them never saw it. But one of the guys, from the other family that stays there, had a somewhat similar experience. He told us that one night he and another friend went out to town and came back late in the evening, but the gate was locked earlier than usual that night, and he forgot his key at the house. Therefore, he decided to climb over the gate and walk to his house to fetch the key, which is pretty far, close to 5 kilometers, passing a few goat paddocks, while his friend waited in the car outside the gate. His friend turned the engine off to save fuel and waited in complete darkness. A while later, he saw flickers of light, similar to fire from a lighter, coming towards him from the other side of the gate. He thought maybe it was just the other guy, and his torchlight ran out of juice, so he switched on the car headlight to help, but to his surprise, nobody was there. The friend told the worker about the lights afterwards, but he just brushed them off until he heard our story. By then, we're pretty certain it was something paranormal. Strangely, it actually happens a few more times after the first sighting, usually around the same time as the first one. My parents decided not to make a big deal about it since it's in our local belief that we have to respect those things. People say that it's the spirit of the forest, and plus, it's not causing any harm to us. One night, my dad came back late alone and, as usual, went to lock the gate. When he got back inside the car, he saw the light again. Then my dad whispered something that went along like, "Look, we both want peace here. Why don't you leave this place alone and go back to where you came from? We are sorry if we did you any wrong that made you come here in the first place," and followed with a few prayers. And as usual, the light moves a few inches close to the ground, then vanishes. From then on, the light never appeared anymore. Until this day, I still have no clue what it is. My dad's house is very new, we built it ourselves. At the time this took place, it was barely a year old. Our land, however, is old. We've seen ghosts there before, lots of weird stuff happens. It's also a bit swampy in the woods. It goes from grassy fields to swampy woods pretty fast on the south end of our land, and that's the area my window faces. So on with the story. I was 10 to 11, laying in bed one night. My dad was going on a business trip, and I was home alone with mom. Well, being a 10-year-old, I didn't really like sleeping that much. But it was late, so I was trying at least. I look out my window, above the forest, and see a floating blue orb. The logical part of my brain kicks in. Is my uncle spotlighting a raccoon? No, it's a blue ball, not a yellow or white light. What is this? I look at it for a minute before I run to get my mom. She was up late reading a novel, so I pulled her back to my room and told her to look at the orb. It had disappeared. She told me it was my overactive imagination and tucked me into bed again. I roll over, dejected, still unable to sleep. I'm going to guess about 10 minutes later, no clock, no phone. I look outside again, and the orb is back, but a little closer. It's hovering in front of the trees, a bit lower. It's not any brighter, it's just closer. So I run to get mom again, who is still awake. By the time she gets back to my room, it's gone again. This happened a few more times, each time the orb got closer. My mom had gotten very annoyed with me and told me not to bother her again after the 4th or 5th time. I'm lying in bed, looking out the window, when it appears directly outside the glass. I'm frozen in fear. What is it? What did it want? Was it going to hurt me? Why? It floated through my window and into my room. It is an orb, but it's not completely illuminating my room. It's just a faint glow. It keeps floating closer to me until it's at the foot of my bed, and I black out. I wake up some time later, not sure exactly. The moon is still in the same general location, so not too long. I run to my window to see if the orb is still there, but instead I'm greeted with a flash of memory from some other time. A boy, my age. Short blonde hair, green eyes, and a smile. A storm, and darkness. I remember hitting the floor, and then I woke up the next morning. This isn't the first time I've seen the boy. I had seen him in a dream before, when I was a little girl. But I won't get into that here, since that was a dream and not a real encounter. I got into urban exploration, or urbex, just because I love the thrill of exploring places long since abandoned. But within that time, I have tended to come across some rather terrifying experiences. Depending on what kind of feedback I get, I'll see if you guys would like to hear any more. But for now, I'll throw up this one. One of my first experiences with the weirder and creepier side of urbex was when I first started back in 2014. About 2 counties over from where I live, there's a mental institution called Central State Hospital. Being on the older side of this county, remnants of the previous buildings from 1926 are still standing. From the historical documents and records that I uncovered while doing some research, Central State Hospital was built following the Civil War to aid in relief efforts for recently freed black slaves. But as time went on, the facility became one of the first in the South to offer mental hospitalization for black patients. The new building is now built right next to the old one. So after some digging, snooping, and spying, I finally worked up the gumption to break in and explore. Armed with a flashlight, a mounting curiosity, and a pry bar, I pulled back one of the boarded-up windows and crawled in. Not knowing what to expect, I began to wander the dark and creepy hallways of the old hospital, checking each room for anything interesting. The facility is basically one large square, with 4-story corners, most likely offices, 2-story corridors, and a now heavily wooded courtyard. Where I got in was the east front corner. I wandered most of the corridors until I found a stairwell leading downstairs. On the sublevel, there was a long corridor that held the autopsy room, morgue, and furnace room. Now, after an hour or so of looking around, reading old documents, and noticing some suspicious drug paraphernalia, I decided to make my way out, seeing as how it was going on at midnight. As I turned around to leave, I noticed that the street security light that you could see from the bottom of the stairs was now absent. To my absolute horror, a massive black figure, about 8 feet tall, stood at the top of the stairwell. Now, being the 6'7" bruiser that I was, I did the most logical thing any man would do. I screamed like the bitch I was, up the stairs, through the figure, out the prying open window, and into the loving arms of Petersburg's finest. Slapped with a potential trespassing charge and sitting in the back of a police cruiser, I was questioned about the screaming. When I told the officer what I had seen, he turned about as white as a sheet. Apparently, since he and his partner started doing rounds on the property, they had constantly seen apparitions all along the open windows on the top floors. Needless to say, I got off with a slap on the wrist and a no more kind of deal. So I'll only share 2 of the creepiest ones that I personally experienced. 1. My 10th birthday party. I had a few of my friends over for a slumber party, and we had our sleeping bags on the floor of the living room. The living room was at the front of the house and behind our front porch. When you walked into the house through the porch, you'd get to the front door. Once in the doorway, there was a staircase to the left, a half bathroom directly in front, and the living room connected to the dining room to the right. Left of the dining room was the kitchen, behind the half bathroom. Okay, so back to the slumber party. We were doing whatever 10-year-old girls do at sleepovers when I got an uneasy feeling. There were windows behind the couch that were directly looking onto the porch. I remember not wanting to look anywhere near the windows. I was sitting on the floor with my friends when, in the corner of my eye, I saw something bright on the stairs. I didn't want to look, but for whatever reason, I did. I looked, and at the bottom of the staircase was a little boy. He was pale, had black hair, and had dark circles around his eyes. He looked calm, and he was just watching. I'm getting chills as I type this. I want to puke. This wasn't the first time I saw him, though. I immediately turned my head, and I was just frozen. While I'm sitting there terrified, one of the girls starts yelling that there is someone on the porch. We booked it upstairs. We locked ourselves in my bedroom, sat in a circle, and listened as the girl told us there was an old woman on the porch. Each of us was rightfully scared shless. Then the crash happened. In the middle of talking, we hear what sounds like glass shattering. Again, frozen. Some of the braver girls, who didn't believe us, decided to go investigate. We followed, and there was nothing. Absolutely nothing was broken. But we all heard it. It sounded like someone smashed the window in with a baseball bat. We ended up sleeping very closely, tucked away in my tiny room that night. Looking back at it, I don't know why I never woke my parents up during any of that. 2. Babysitting my youngest sister. At this time, it was just me and my 3 sisters. Ages, 13, 5, and 2, I was still 10. My older sister and I were home from school with a stomach bug. My mom had to go get my 5-year-old sister from school and asked us to watch our youngest sister. We were sitting in the living room, and she was eating some snacks and had a sippy cup of water. The top of the cup must have not been screwed on tight enough because, when she knocked it over, water spilled everywhere. My older sister went to the kitchen to get some napkins to clean it up. When she came back, she handed me some of the napkins, and we both started cleaning. We were on our hands and knees, wiping up the water, when we started to hear banging coming from the second floor. We both paused, looked at each other, and said nothing. But we both had that look of "you heard that too, right?" We stayed silent and kept cleaning. Then again, another bang. At this point, we stand up and are still silent, just staring at the ceiling. Then came the giggles. We heard little kids upstairs ducking laugh. Then the laughter turned to singing. Just little children singing what sounded like choir singing. My sister scooped up the baby, and we ran outside. It was a clear day out that day, and I remember once we got outside, it started to rain. We had no choice but to go back inside, but we stayed on the front porch until my mom got home. I have so many more stories, but it's too much to share right now. I'm 28 now, and I still have nightmares monthly about being inside that house. There are times now when I question myself about whether any of that happened and try to search my memory for anything that could have an explanation, but I just can't. Living there honestly changed us all forever. Let me know what you think. I tell this story a lot to my buddy, who I was with when it happened. It's the only paranormal experience I have had, so it's not minor to me, it might be to others. In high school, my buddy and I would often sneak away, drive to the local cemetery, and walk around for no reason other than to be somewhere we shouldn't be. We had been there a while and had made it toward the back, where most of the older stones were. I was on the phone with a girlfriend, but my buddy stopped me and told me to listen. I put the phone away from my ear and heard this loud thudding noise, repeating in constant for a good 10 seconds. It stopped, and I hung up on the girlfriend. My buddy and I were staring right at each other when it started again. It was as if I could feel the ground vibrating with each thud, and as crazy as this seems, it sounded like it was right beneath us. The sound persisted as my buddy ran away, and I quickly followed. We wish we would have stayed to try and figure something out, but the best answer I've gotten from someone while telling this story was a groundhog chewing through a tree root. A tree root amongst the gravestones? Possible, but I guess I'll never truly know. A friend and I had an assignment for a photography class, so she had asked me if I wanted to go with her to a historical house to take pictures. The house was called Macbeth's house. It's found in Winnipeg, Manitoba. I'm super into ghosts and the paranormal. I've had experiences since I was 3. I can do anything when it comes to ghost hunting and communicating with spirits, but what I cannot do is see shadow figures. We were walking along the path that leads down to the river, and my dumbass wanted to take pictures of the house to see if there would be something standing in the window. Just walking down the path, I had this erroneous feeling. What made it worse was that there was a path of Christmas boughs leading into the woods. It gave off the Japanese suicide forest vibes. After I took the photos, I didn't think anything of them. Later, when I was at home, I went through the photos, and sure enough, there was a face in the window. I know the house gets rented out, but that day there was no one in the house. Because I went to the door and knocked to see if we could get into it and take photos, no one was inside. I'll start off by saying that I grew up in a very haunted house. As a child, I had frequent encounters with the paranormal. My first memory of seeing something completely unexplainable was when I was just 4 years old, and the image is still engraved into my head. I remember being awake in the early hours of the morning with my bedroom door wide open. The hallway light was on, meaning if anyone were to walk past, their shadow would project onto my wall. Out of nowhere, a shadow of a tall man with a top hat appeared, and the person began to walk. But the strange thing is that they began to walk and not move. They were just standing in the same place, walking. I have never seen anything like this again, and to this day, I am still baffled as to what I saw. Another harrowing experience happened a bit earlier in the night, when I was about 9 years old. At the time, I was trying to sleep but had an uneasy feeling. There had been a power cut in my room, so my television was turned off, which meant I couldn't sleep, as I had always slept with the TV on. As I was looking at the blank TV, I noticed that in the reflection, something stood just outside my bedroom door. To my eyes, it looked like the build of a child. I dismissed it as an illusion, as I didn't want to believe anything was there. I went underneath my covers, and then a few moments later, I heard loud footsteps beside my bed. I didn't look, I closed my eyes and pretended I heard nothing. The footsteps stopped, and I managed to fall asleep a few minutes later. The weirdest encounter I ever experienced was what I believe was the same thing I saw in my previous story. However, this happened a few years later. I was about 14 and it was around 4 a.m. I couldn't sleep as, again, I had an uneasy feeling and felt like I was being watched. This was a common feeling for me in my house. I heard strange noises and tried to dismiss them as nothing, but then suddenly, at the end of my bed, a black figure stood. It was about 5 feet high, and it had a blurry outline. I couldn't make out what it was, nor would I be able to draw any images of it. I can only describe it as a black, shadowy figure with neither a face nor any human resemblance. The figure ran to the side of my bed, pushed my bunk bed ladder over, and then completely disappeared. At the time, I was speechless. I didn't even make a sound. No scream, no shout, no anything. These are the 3 experiences that have fully resonated with me. I had played or messed around with Ouija boards before. My first time, I was super skeptical, but my friend insisted weird SHT happened whenever they used it. My friend told me this board was an actual wooden board made in Salem, Massachusetts, that was passed down through her family. I kept telling my friend I didn't believe it, but after using it a couple times, I was no longer a skeptic. It was amazing to me. My whole life, I had just thought of it as a toy, a kid's board game. It was easy for me to get sucked into it since I had no idea that I was playing with fire. I continued using Ouija boards and showed them to all my friends. We would write out the alphabet, draw a board on a glass table, and find something to use as the planchette, and even that would work. It was magical and mystical. Being able to talk to people from the past. Ask questions that no one should know the answer to but myself, but the board would know. It would always answer correctly. We spoke to a cobbler from Mexico. I had no idea what a cobbler even was. I thought they worked with cobblestone and made roads. Apparently, they work with shoes. We spoke to a Nazi spirit. They answered they lived through World War II and were German Nazis, who really didn't like me and just spelled out inferior over and over whenever I asked a question. I'm a minority. However, this Nazi spirit had no qualms about answering anything my white friend would ask. This went on for quite a while until I finally had an experience that made me quit for good. I had become uneasy after doing some research and realizing I was inviting spirits, bad or good, into my house with no knowledge of their intentions. My last time was at a house party. A group of my friends who knew that I believed Ouija boards were real and worked told me there was one at the house where the party was held and that they wanted me to prove it. I was a little wary, but with my friends constantly telling me I was faking and lying, I decided to show them. When I went into the room where they were attempting to use the Ouija board, there were a group of about 8 people laughing, yelling, not paying attention, etc. I let them know they would have to respect the spirits for them to respond. Once everyone calmed down, we started. My friends asked, "Is anyone here?" And the planchette barely moved. They told me to try. I asked, "Is anyone there?" And the planchette, held by 4 people, started to glide over to hello. My friends were still skeptical and said I was moving it, so I had them hold the planchette and just ask questions. My next question was, "What is your name?" It spelled out 666. I asked a bunch of names that start with 6. "Is your name Victoria? Victor? Vivian? Vivica?" All of those questions were met with the planchette was sliding to no, and it kept spelling out 666. Suddenly, one of my friends gasped and said, "That's the Roman numeral 666, and the planchette slid to yes. Suddenly, people were standing up and screaming, throwing the board, and running out of the room. I had enough sense to make sure to say goodbye on the board and end the session. After that, I was so shaken that I walked out of the room and left the rest of the people there. About 10 minutes later, I hear a shriek, and the people in the room call my name. I ask what's going on, and they say, "The board stopped working after you left," but when we asked, "Do you want to talk to him?" it slid straight to yes. I said, "Duck no. I am not playing again and nope the hell out there. I've never touched a Ouija board again." I'm from New England, USA. Back in 2005, I was vacationing on an island off the coast of New Brunswick, Canada, at my cousin's vacation home. My family went with them and some other cousins for around a week. There wasn't enough room in the house for everyone, so the other boys and I stayed outside in my tent. I was about 15 at the time, and the two other boys were about 13 and 10. We were very close to a beach, and there was a large patch of reeds in the backyard that ran alongside the side of the house up to the road with a section of grass in between. One night, the older of the two and I got up to take a leak. We turned to face the reed patch and noticed a distinct glow coming from it. There was an apparition that was clearly in the shape of a fox, but the body was like a white fog. It was a clear night, and there wasn't any fog out. Just this fox-shaped apparition. About 15 to 25 feet away from us. It glowed like an LED but was easy on the eyes to look at. It had no eyes, mouth, or nose on its face, and no distinct facial features or eyeshine. We could see through it. It seemed like it was looking directly at us. It started walking away from us on a perpendicular path away from the road. It disturbed the reeds as it walked. After it walked a short distance for about half a minute, it turned to its left to move deeper into the reeds and completely vanished. The light and everything were gone in an instant. We weren't at all afraid of this, but we were left with a sense of wonder. We slept easily after that. A good 14 to 15 years later, I finally decided to look into what it might have been. For some reason, it didn't dawn on me to look into it until then. What we saw just about perfectly matches a Kiko Kitsune spirit from Japanese folklore. Has anyone seen any kind of fox spirit or similar entity? I'm very interested to hear about any possible sightings. One night in August, I woke up at 4:53 a.m. Yes, I have remembered and written down the exact time. I had fallen asleep earlier that night watching Netflix on my Xbox. The Xbox shuts down after a certain period of activity, and when it does, my TV screen turns blue. Anyway, I opened my eyes to the blue light-filled room. I turned over, and as I did, I stopped midway. In front of my TV was not a human. And no, this wasn't sleep paralysis, I was able to move fully and such. He had thin hair creeping out of this ugly hat. His sharp teeth were exposed, and he creepily grinned at me. And that ugly striped shirt is ducking horrible. He wasn't short, but he wasn't slender or tall either. I turned my head into the covers, barely being able to breathe but not wanting to look at whatever the hell that was. After what felt like hours but had only been a few minutes, I peered back towards the TV, and the creature had now moved to the corner of my room. I then again turned away from it, tucking all my limbs under the blanket and curling up. I had eventually fallen asleep, and when I woke up in the morning, nobody was there. I had then drawn what he looked like in hopes of someone knowing who or what it was. I was about 12 years old. I lived in a house with my mom, brother, sister, and aunt. During the summer, I would usually be in the downstairs den with my aunt, who would stay up late drinking beer and watching MASH 4077 reruns that she had recorded on VHS. Mom was always in bed early since she was still working, but my aunt had retired, so we kept each other company at night. A lot of times, I would fall asleep on the couch there. Sometimes I would sleep through the night. Other times I would wake up in the night and go to my bed upstairs. It was a fairly large house, and this den and my bedroom were in opposite corners and on different floors. My point here is that it was a relatively long walk to get from the den to my bedroom. One night, like any other, I woke up on the couch. So I grabbed the blanket I was using and started my way to my bedroom. When I got to the stairs, I made sure to walk on the edges to keep them from creaking because my aunt's bedroom was directly under the stairs and my mom's right at the top, and I had been fussed at for waking them before. When I made it to the top, I peeked into my mom's bedroom to make sure I didn't wake her. What I saw at the foot of her bed on the floor really terrified me. It was small, maybe 3 feet. It had orange-yellowish skin. No hair. Lean but muscular. Naked, no genitalia. It had a mouth and face like a canine with no ears or hair, but its eyes protruded out and were very buggy. It was walking fast and running in a small circle with its forearms pressed against its chest and its palms open. It was also gazing upward. It seemed like the circle and or the area around the creature were illuminated. It almost seemed like it was in distress, but it was really ducked up looking too, so I don't know. I screamed like I never had before, or after, and ran into my brother's bedroom. I woke up the entire house, and everyone freaked out because they thought someone had broken in or something. I slept with my aunt that night because I knew she kept a revolver under her pillow. I never really had a problem being scared of the dark, ghosts, or whatever before then, but after that, I was terrified all the time. I never slept well, and I used to think everyone had nightmares every night, because I did for years. I still have them more regularly than most, but nothing like I did then. I'm 32 now and attribute it to being an extraordinary case of sleepwalking, but it took years of them taking me to a psychiatrist to get over it. It wasn't a shadow, eyes in the dark, or something I saw in the corner of my eye. It looked as real and solid as anything I'm looking at now, and I felt completely awake and lucid when it happened. I had an experience with the Glimmer man in the late 90s at my parents' house in Lowell, Massachusetts. I will never forget this experience, as it was the most terrifying encounter I have ever had in my life. 2 deployments to Iraq and 8 years as a cop. Nothing comes close to the fear I had that day. I remember this happening in the late 90s, and I would say somewhere between 1997 and 1999. I would have been between 10 and 12 years old. We had 2 phone lines in our house. The main line is located in the living room, and the second is in my brother's room. My 2 oldest brothers had already moved out of the house, and my brother wasn't home at the time. I asked my mom if I could go hang out with my friend, who lived 2 blocks away. She agreed, but I remember that she was using our main line. I went upstairs to use my brother's phone to call my friend. I walked into my brother's room and began to dial my buddy's number. I got about halfway through dialing, and I froze. All the hairs on my body stood up, and I was covered in goosebumps. It felt like my stomach sank. This feeling of being watched and that something came in the room behind me just hit me from nowhere. I knew it was there. I felt its presence. It was like it wanted me to know it was there. I slowly lowered the phone from my ear and carefully turned around. It was standing in the doorway of my brother's room, blocking my escape. It was huge. It was as tall as the doorframe and about as wide. I couldn't see eyes, but I knew it was staring at me. It looked crystal clear as water with the edge of a human form. Its cloaking, or invisibility, appeared to fluctuate. Like the way the light passed through, it seemed to refract in different directions. It was almost like water that could take human form, but it obviously wasn't water. The only other way I could describe it was like a predator. In the short period of time that I locked eyes on this creature or being, I began to pray profusely and uncontrollably. It felt like I had no control, and the words shot from my mouth. In seconds that probably felt like minutes, it stepped into the room and towards the windows across from the door. I never bothered to see where it went or if it disappeared. The moment I saw the opportunity to escape, I bolted from that room and down the stairs. I ran probably the fastest I have ever run in my life. I'm not even sure how I didn't get hurt. My mom, who was just getting off the phone, asked me if I was alright. She could tell me something that scared the hell out of me. I'm now 35, and thankfully, I haven't experienced or seen anything else like that since, and I'd like to keep it that way. I'm glad that I am not the only one who has seen them, as it made me question my sanity. I consider myself to be skeptical and still try to figure out logical explanations for what happened, but I can't. So, what the hell are these things? Undiscovered life forms that have been here all along? Evil beings / spirits / demons? Aliens? It seems to me that in most encounters I've read, they instill fear and terror. Shortly after graduating high school, I moved in with some friends. They were a newly married couple. Rick, the husband, and I knew each other from having grown up on the same street. I met Carol, his wife, when they were dating in junior year. We were pretty much inseparable for about 5 years, with me being the third wheel. My friends bought an older house in town since they were expecting their first child soon. It was a small 3-bed, 1.5 bathroom house with a quaint backyard. I moved into the new house with them, as it was a pretty ideal situation since we were all doing our best to cut expenditures and save money. As most friends and roommates do, we talked about all kinds of things. We talked about movies, food, people we knew, and likes and dislikes. Carol mentioned during one of these conversations that one of her dislikes was taking baths. She said she never felt the same level of cleanliness that one would get from a shower. I agreed. However, 2 nights later, something happened that made me question her aversion to baths. It was just about dawn when I woke up, needing to use the bathroom. It generally takes an act of God to get me up from bed if I have to pee. I can usually hold it for hours, even while sleeping, because I don't want to get up. This day was different, however, and the urge was undeniable. I proceeded to get up and walk to the shared main bathroom. The bathroom door was adjacent to my room. As I opened the door, I saw that the shower curtain on the tub had been pulled back about halfway and that Carol was taking a bath. I also heard the water running. Her head and face were facing towards me, which seemed odd to me at that moment. That would mean she would have had her head resting against the faucet. Unless she was rinsing her hair, that would be an awkward place to rest your head. I hurriedly excused myself with an apology, stating I didn't know the bathroom was already occupied. I went back to my bed and sat for about 7 to 10 minutes, waiting for her to exit the bathroom. I wouldn't use the half bath located adjoining the master bedroom because that would be awkward and potentially wake up Rick. After waiting for what seemed like an eternity, and still not having heard Carol come out of the bathroom, I decided to just go out in the backyard to relieve myself. The sunrise was probably just coming over the horizon at the time. It was pretty safe to assume that no neighbors were going to see me. I finished up and went back to bed for another hour. After I woke up, I went to the kitchen and saw Carol in the kitchen. Rick had already left for work. She was wearing a bathrobe and was cooking breakfast. After morning pleasantries, I jokingly said to her, "You got up pretty early this morning. And for not being much of a bath person, you sure took a long one this morning." She looked at me confused and replied, "What do you mean?" I responded, "Sorry, I interrupted your bath this morning. I didn't mean to. I waited a while for you to get out, but then I just couldn't hold it any longer and went out back. I didn't want to wake Rick up." She just stared back at me, even more bewildered. I assured her that I didn't see her naked, that I only saw her face and hair above the water, and that the shower curtain had covered up the rest of her. I also told her that it must have been uncomfortable with her head resting against the faucet. She finally cracked a smile and said, "Come on, you're joking. I just got up. I haven't even showered yet." That's when I noticed that her hair was dry, and she even had a bit of bedhead. After a few minutes of back and forth between her insisting I was joking and me telling her I absolutely wasn't, we were both a bit speechless. Carol called Rick at work and confirmed it wasn't him taking a bath that morning either. I'm pretty much a skeptic when it comes to the supernatural and the paranormal, even though I like reading stories and watching movies about those subjects. Carol was, and still is, pretty leery of those topics and doesn't like to discuss them, as they creep her out even now. I still cannot to this day say with 100% accuracy what I saw, but it was very real in the moment, and I was very much awake and not sleepwalking nor vividly dreaming. While we were working on the house before we moved in, me and my boyfriend both felt very uneasy alone at night, and during the day, I wouldn't step foot in here without my dog. Also, the house across the street is haunted, not sure if that has any correlation. We've been here for about a year. Our first night, I saw something in my dining room with white long hair that totally glitched out, like mouth open, convulsing head back and forth super fast. I just went to bed because I was trying to convince myself it was just me. I seem to be able to sense and see energies, I guess. My daughter is 2 and told me people are in her room. She has become afraid of the dark, and she screams bloody murder about something under my bed. More than 5 times when I was alone, the electricity cut out and back on for a minute at a time. It'll go on for 10 or so minutes, and my dog will bark and growl so aggressively down the pitch black hallway, there's no outside door, it only leads to bedrooms, that it scares the absolute shit out of me. My boyfriend has seen 2 old ladies looking at him through the doorway while he is sleeping. You feel the negative energy in here, it's very heavy. But there are more concerning things that happened, which makes me very uneasy. My daughter started screaming in the middle of the night. I got up to go down the hallway to her, but I was struck by pure fear to the point where I was trembling and trying to make it to her. I felt like something was holding me back or making it hard for me to get to her. The back of our house is miles of wood. There's no reason for someone to be back there, but I see a flashlight go on for maybe a minute. I'm staring at it. It shuts off and moves 30 feet. It turns back on about 5 times. I see this. I send my boyfriend out to go look in with the dog, and he sees nothing. This happened on 3 different occasions. I'm the only human who can see the light, apparently. I will sit outside at night to smoke, and here is a woman talking in the woods. I run in to get him, and as soon as he comes out, she stops talking. The same is true with an animal crying. My boyfriend can't hear it, and as soon as he comes out, it stops. But I know I can't be crazy because the dogs also hear it. Finally, one night while we were in bed, I was asleep and didn't experience this. My daughter came in the room at night and started talking to my boyfriend, just rambling. He couldn't remember what she was saying, and all of a sudden he got this feeling and yelled, "You're not _ my daughter's name," and this entity disappeared. So now I have something in here that is able to make itself look and act like my child. I got so freaked out. My boyfriend called this guy, he is Spanish, and he gave me something I never even got the name of, this plastic wrap. It looks like a cube of sugar, maybe with a strong smell. You throw it in a vase with water, and it turns blue, and I put it in my daughter's room. It offers her protection. It's been a couple months, and nothing significant has happened. Except I can still feel it at night, like I'm not alone, and I get this random feeling of just dread, and I still hear SHT outside at night. I know there's something here, but I just don't know where to start or how to get rid of it. So when I was about 16, I was home with my dad. My mom, grandma, and 2 sisters had gone to a movie that night. I did not know this when the event occurred, so I was in my room talking to my dad, about to take a shower. All of a sudden, both my dad and I heard a woman call out to me, saying, "Michael, I need you." I figured it was either my mom or sister, so I walked into my hallway and called out, asking for them. When I walked back into the room, my dad's face was kind of pale. I asked him where they were, and he then informed me that he and I were the only ones in the house. My heart started to beat out of my chest. So we then decided to walk through the house to make sure there wasn't a TV, radio, etc. Everything was shut off in the house, barring the hallway lights, and all windows were closed. We gave up trying to understand what had happened or how it happened, and I decided to take a shower, with the lights on. I never felt threatened when all of this was happening. I didn't have the impending doom feeling some people describe when having paranormal encounters. And I honestly didn't lose any sleep over it except for the night that it happened. I wonder if someone might be able to explain logically what it could have been, or if you can explain if there are things like just wandering spirits. If it was a wandering spirit, how did it know my name? I've told this story to many people, but everyone always scoffs. When I was about 15 to 16 years old, I am 23 now. I was at home when I got a phone call from one of my close cousins, whom I see all the time in the mid-afternoon, so nothing seemed off that she would call. Anyway, she went on to tell me that our grandma and grandpa just experienced what I would call a demon. My grandpa drives a school bus, gets ready, and is out the door very early on school days. So on this day, as he was getting ready, nothing seemed out of the blue until he exited the house. Okay, now at this point in time, the only people left in the house were my grandma and 2 of my cousins, who were sleeping in a different room on the same floor. They said that as soon as my grandpa closed the front door, my grandma instantly started screaming, and they both got up as quickly as they could to see what was going on. As they entered the room, they saw my grandma lying on the bed with her blanket and her nightgown raised into the air, as if some invisible force was pulling at it from the end of the bed where her feet were. She screamed and screamed, and then both of my cousins started freaking out. Luckily, one of them ran out, and my grandpa hadn't left yet. As soon as she told him what was going on, he ran back inside, and as he entered the house, my grandma stopped screaming, and that's where that ended. Fast forward about 2 to 3 months, and my grandma and grandpa were out driving to the city. They live on a reservation. Once they got there, they parked the car. My grandpa got out and walked around the truck as he usually does, and my grandma started to get herself out as well. As she opened the door and started to get out, she said she felt a push, and she fell out of the truck, breaking her leg. They both attribute her breaking her leg to the same ghost, demon, or entity that was in her room only a few months prior to this incident. Fast forward another 2 months, and this is where my direct experience with a demon happened. My grandpa, grandma, and one of my cousins, who has lived with them since she was a baby, were all exhausted from the last couple of months and the eeriness of still living in the same house. My grandpa contacted a medicine man and woman, and he said for his ritual that we would need as much of our direct family as we could. We have a huge family. So we made the plans for it, and a lot of my aunts, uncles, and cousins came over to my grandpa's house. The medicine man had us all sit in the living room in a circle. He would beat on his drum, chant, and sing for what seemed like hours, all with the lights off in a completely dark room. He stopped chanting once for us all to smoke from his peace pipe, and once again for everyone to eat and offer food to the spirits he was channeling for help. We smoked and ate. At about the 2.5-hour mark, I really needed to go to the bathroom. I was pestering my mom constantly, asking her when the next break would be so I could please go to the bathroom. Finally, the medicine man and woman stopped their singing and said that if anyone needed some water or to go to the bathroom, go do it now because we were likely going to be sitting in the circle for a while longer. This is where SHT gets crazy. I got up and ran to the bathroom because I figured if I have to go this bad, then probably everyone does too, so I got in there first, and as I closed the door, it was definitely 100% closed. I heard it click in and everything. I felt a fingernail push into the top center of my back, just an inch or 2 below the back of my neck. It didn't feel like a sharp pin, a pencil, a pen, or even a knife. I knew as soon as I felt it that it was a fingernail. It felt long and very feminine. As soon as I felt it, I jolted and shot my head around, only to see nothing but a closed door. I thought maybe it was one of my cousins just trying to scare or prank me, but it wasn't. I opened the door, ran back out, and just sat next to my mom. I had to pee the entire time, but there was no way I was going to go back into that bathroom. Anyway, my cousin, grandma, and grandpa all still live in the same house. They said since the medicine man came, there have been absolutely no signs or feelings of a malevolent spirit in their house or around them, and no incidents have happened since. I have told my mom, siblings, and cousins, whom I was very close to years later, and they all seem to believe what I have to say, but nobody really has anything to add or give me feedback on. It's usually just a "whoa dude, that's insane" kind of response. Ever since becoming a theist and converting to my religion a couple of years ago, I've been having frequent encounters with the unseen. It started with going back to my motherland, where magic is ubiquitous, along with supernatural encounters. My aunt first relayed a story of someone in our family who practices black magic. One day, as she was making tomato sauce for my family, my grandfather heard her chanting something under her breath. They later packaged the sauce into jars. Weeks later, when they opened them, every single jar had needles sitting atop the sauce. Some smaller stuff happened too. For instance, my aunts and all their friends regularly visited this shrink/psychic who eerily knows and predicts everything. All in all, I went from an atheist to a believer. That was when the encounter started. I would be talking to someone in a dream, and suddenly, their pupils or eyes would change and their voice would deepen, which I later learned are the two biggest signs of demonic possession. Anytime I would go to sleep without saying a prayer for protection, I was attacked. When this happened once more and I underwent sleep paralysis, I woke up fuming because I was so over it. I began to curse out whatever it was. I went into the kitchen. My mom was there, and only the stove light was on. She was on the counter opposite the stove, as was I. Suddenly, I heard a loud click, and everything went dark. My mom went, "Hey, why'd you turn it off? I'm still in here." Neither of us were near the stove, and the light switch is heavy and requires a lot of pressure to switch off, hence how loud it is. For a long time, nothing else happened, until recently. A new activity I've undertaken is going near the woods at night. They're right by my place, near the water I usually walk by, and I'm also an adrenaline junkie, so the feeling is just incredibly thrilling. However, my mom ended up having sleep paralysis the last 2 nights that I went. Whenever this happens, she starts wailing and crying in her sleep, and someone has to wake her up. Before I found out what she'd seen, I was getting ready to back out to the woods. However, a tweet caught my eye. Someone tweeted about driving through the forest at night and seeing people with their faces upside down running through a field. Under it was the famous story of that forest rescuer, the one that talks about seeing stairs and stuff. A story I distinctly remembered reading was from someone who went up the stairs, whose grandfather told them that they used to appear as doors and never to go up them if you see any. Once I was done reading, I asked my mom what she saw. Both nights, she saw a door. And behind that door was a faceless figure in a black cloak. Later, I find out the place I'd ventured to on those 2 nights was once a mass grave where the Chinese used to bury their dead, and their bodies had at one point been exhumed. Moreover, there's a rowing club I was sitting right across from that's listed as one of the most haunted places in my city. The crazy part? I still felt the urge to go deeper. I wanted to go into the woods. The only reason I didn't was because my religion instructs us to stay away from trees and water past sunset, as that's where you'll find demonic entities, and I knew there would be no prayer to protect me from my stupidity. The last time this occurred was a week ago, when I finished watching one of the most disturbing, demonic movies I've ever seen, Demons by Toshio Matsumoto. Right as I finished watching it, my mom's wailing started again. The only thing I'm curious about is why it never attacks me. Is it because I'm protected? Or because I'm not scared of it but rather fascinated, and I might even seek it out due to how much it strengthens my faith? Man, When I was 14, I just received the iPod Touch, 4th generation, I believe. Whichever model came with the wired headphones that first came with a mic, I'm embarrassed to say, but I'm lying in bed singing to myself and recording it via voice memos. Specifically, it was a song by Keen. About halfway through, my voice fades to the background, which makes no sense as I had the wired headphones in both ears, leaving the mic close to my mouth. A dark and grumbling voice mumbles a few words I couldn't distinguish before ending with "go die." My voice then returns to normal volume. I've lost the recording, and the only people I got to show out of embarrassment of them hearing my singing were my mother and brother. I was so terrified to hear this that I immediately ran to my dad's room and jumped into bed. I didn't say a word, I just laid next to him. At the time, there was a lot of turmoil within the house, and we did not get along, so for me, this was big. The house we lived in had its fair share of odd occurrences as well. We'd dig up a footlocker below the crawl space that contains children's underwear. The room outside the crawl space had been a private dance studio before we moved in and was covered in mirrors. The heater was a dial-like thing that turned left to right. We'd wake up to it turning all the way to the right, which was 90 degrees. My dad and grandma both claimed to hear footsteps and children laughing at late hours while in the house alone. Another unexplained occurrence happened in our garage. We had a Coleman camping stove that was fairly heavy and stored on a shelf that was angled upwards so anything placed on it wouldn't fall. It flew off right over my dad's head. My 2 other brothers and myself witnessed this. One final note is that the room I stayed in was in the basement. It was the only bedroom in the basement, and I constantly had a negative mood, aura, or attitude while in the room. A specific corner seemed to always get darker at night. At one point, I piled whatever I had lying around from floor to ceiling into the corner because I strongly felt like I was being watched. The room would go cold, and I eventually had the urge to block out the light and keep it cold. I moved out at 15 to my mother, and my middle brother took my room and only lasted a week before going back to sharing with our youngest brother upstairs, claiming he also felt scared to stay there. So I have never been able to figure out if what I experienced was just a weird dream or if I really had a paranormal experience. My grandparents live on this old, dead-end road in the mountains of North Carolina. The roads are about 5 miles long and basically just a trail through the woods, with a few old houses built in the woods along them. This one house on the road has been sold probably a dozen times, as far as I remember. And it's not the fact that it's been sold so many times. It's the fact that it doesn't stay occupied for long. I can't tell you how many times I've seen families move in, and without fail, they've moved out in a hurry within a month. When I was about 14, me and my friends got very curious about whether it was haunted or just scary, so we decided to break in and spend the night inside the house one night. Around 10 o'clock, we piled our sleeping bags and some food and soda onto a few four-wheelers and drove over there. When we arrived, we looked through the downstairs area with our flashlights and explored the downstairs and porches, not daring to go into the basement or upstairs because it was scary. We then played cards, ate snacks, and vaped like teenage idiots until we decided to go to sleep. You know, normal sleepover stuff. And everything was normal until I was asleep. In my dream, I was in the living room, and it was dimly lit. But what was weird was that a dark figure was sitting across the room from me, smoking a cigarette. Just seeing him there, smoking silently, freaked me out. Then he spoke. "What are you boys doing in my house?" he said. "We're just seeing what makes it so scary, sir," I told him. "I'm what makes it scary," he said, and I stood up and saw your face. He was an old man with a mean, stern look on his face, like the kind of man who would kick your ass for stepping on his grass. I then started to feel like I was choking in a dream, like it felt so real. And then I woke up in a sweat. The following morning, me and my friends explored the rest of the house, and in the basement, I found a picture of the exact man in my dream. I then freaked out and, to be honest, stole the picture from the house to show my grandmother. She then pointed out that the man lived there when she was a little girl, she's 87 now, and that he died in a bed fire caused by falling asleep while smoking. I have never been back there since. The house is still constantly being sold, but it has never been lived in for long. I don't blame them. Last Tuesday, my 21st birthday, I was super bored, and I've been taking a lot of walks since coming back home from university for quarantine. I decided to take a walk. I didn't really have any specific direction I was going to go in, but then I remembered there's a very large cemetery a couple miles from where I live. The place is called Belcrest. It's not an old cemetery, and most of the grave markers I saw were placed after the 1980s. I make it to this cemetery, and I just start walking around. There's a large path that goes around the cemetery, so I went along that. I don't know about anyone else, but cemeteries always have a really different atmosphere than any place outside of them, even places near the cemetery. For me, when I step into a cemetery, it feels like everything is silent, besides the sound of birds and wind blowing through trees, and it also feels really calm. As I walk through this place, I'm just alone with my thoughts, and I stop occasionally to look at grave markers along the path. About half of the cemetery backs into the forest, and the big path I took around goes right by the forested portion of the park. This is where I started hearing something strange. It sounded like many different names were being said in the forest. I stopped at several points just to try to get a better understanding of what I was hearing. I only made out the names Marty and Laura, but I know there were more. This continued for a bit until the path went away from the forest and continued to a pond. This pond had a really odd atmosphere, and I did see some ducks in it, but I would hear rustling around in the bushes near the pond even though I never saw any animals that made this noise. After I stepped away from the pond, I think my paranoia got the better of me. I started whistling, which is something I do when I get anxious. As I whistled, I started hearing different noises all around me. These noises continued after I stopped whistling to try to make out the noises I was hearing too. I'd hear more rustling in the bushes, walking through the trees, and steps on the gravel pathway. At this point, I continued to fast walk back to where I came in so I could leave. I also felt like I was being watched during this. My whistling was disturbing people, and they were watching me and waiting for me to leave the cemetery. So I did just that, and as soon as I left, all of the weird feelings and atmosphere subsided. The wind picked up speed, I was able to hear the noises of people doing yard work and driving, and everything was back to normal. Even though this was a week ago, I've still noticed weird things after visiting. For example, my room is usually the warmest room in the house due to my frog's tank with a heat pad, my computer, and the insulation. However, the room had a cold spot in it right between my bed and the window. I've never felt a cold spot before now, and it creeped me out. I've also been having strange dreams, not creepy ones, but just dreams that I've never really had before. 2 incidents follow that one. My brother and 2 of my friends saw me in separate events, but it wasn't me. Nothing for years. My kids and their friend followed something that looked like me but, again, wasn't me. My boyfriend says he's heard me talking to him when I wasn't there. I heard my daughter's distinctive cough when she wasn't home. At 16, I was helping a friend paint her mom's rental. I was in the living room and needed something, so I called my friend's name. When I turned around, I saw her go into the bedroom, behind the plastic protective sheets. I followed her in there, talking to her. As I passed through the plastic, I caught a glimpse of her walking into the bathroom in the far left corner of the room. As I rounded the area and could now see the bathroom, I realized there wasn't anyone there. I called my friend's name again, she had been outside. Not long after that first incident, 2 more followed in quick succession. I walked into my living room, and my much older brother was giving me a weird look. He told me that I had walked past him through my kitchen, living room, and bedroom. He was talking to me, and I wouldn't answer. Then I walked out of my room in the opposite direction of the bedroom he saw me walk into. Not long after, I was having a party, had gone to the store, and was back at my house outside smoking. 2 of my friends came out to the front yard and asked if I had come in the house at all since coming back from the store. I said no. They said they saw me walk into the house, past them. They were trying to talk to me, but I didn't talk back, I just walked past them to my room. They followed me, but I wasn't in my room. Because I wasn't in the house. Then nothing for years. From 18 to 30. 30-year-old me has 2 kids. 4 and 7 at the time. And they have a friend, 6. I'm in the garage working out with my 6-year-old mom. My kids were in the playhouse phase, so I'd frequently hear, "Mom." Only to be told it wasn't me they were calling. So I hear them all playing, and I hear, "Mom. Hey mom. Mom," and I tell my friend I don't know whether to go in or wait. They know we're in the garage, no one comes out. I think they were playing. A few minutes later, the door opens, and my older daughter comes out and says, "Wow, Mom. How'd you do that? Are you magic?" She tells me that they were playing and wanted a drink. When she came out of the room, I was walking across the living room. Her and the other 2 followed me into a bedroom, but I wasn't there. She said, "I called your name, but you didn't answer, and then I saw you go into the room, but now you're out here. How did you do that?" I told her I'd been outside the whole time, and she looked at me so confused and said, "But mommy, it had your hair." Nothing happened again for a while until this year. I work nights, and my partner works days. I got a text at 4 a.m. one morning asking if I had been talking to my partner over our security cameras. I hadn't. He told me that he had fallen asleep on the couch and woke up to me, saying, "Hey, come to bed." I said no, I wasn't on camera, but maybe he was still sleeping? He said he thought that too, until I said it again, more angrily. It wasn't me, though. I'm now 35, and yesterday I heard my younger daughter's very distinctive cough coming from her room. But she wasn't here. It's never anything malicious, but it's one of the very few unexplainable things I have in my life. Let me adjust my tin foil hat for a second. My theory is that it's haunting based on alternate reality versions of myself and others. It's almost as if another timeline is getting merged with this one. But that's so far out there. I just can't figure out what it is. Has anyone had similar experiences or had some logical explanation for these events? I worked as a meter reader for a while and worked across nearly every part of Melbourne, walking endlessly through both busy and quiet suburbs, leafy and concrete. I worked around funeral homes, abandoned places, and even an old asylum. But the creepiest experience I ever had was out in Diamond Creek. Now, let me just say that I didn't experience one specific thing or really see anything creepy, but the energy I felt around me that day was super off-putting. I started off at a funeral home, took a shortcut through a somewhat shifty graveyard, and continued working amongst the residential houses. All day I was experiencing these weird little coincidences, and I just overall had a heavy feeling in my gut that I either needed to hurry or get out. My maps kept failing me and losing where I was, despite not losing reception or internet at any stage. At one point, a van pulled into the driveway I was walking down, blaring the same song I was listening to on my headphones at the time, not super weird, but an old random song that's not even popular anymore, and it was just an unmarked van kind of doing nothing. Further up the road, I started to feel really off again, and then someone's cat approached me and pretty much glued itself to my leg for the whole rest of the street. From what I know, cats are really good at sensing unpleasant energy, and I almost felt like it was protecting me. I won't list everything, but all day I experienced little things that made me jumpy and nervous, until my stomach was flipping so much and my head basically just told me to get out and go home. I was so panicked that was the day I actually quit. I've never really experienced that feeling before in general, and I definitely hadn't had it while working that job before. I generally love the eastern suburbs too, how green and peaceful they are, but man, that did not feel good. When I was around 8, my parents started looking to move the family into the countryside. Our current neighborhood was nice, we had a small creek in the woods, which I adored as a child, but the area had begun to attract more drugs and crime. We did not have much money, so it took a lot of time to find what we needed. Finally, my parents decided we would buy some scrub land, all forest, not very valuable or useful. We visited a lot of places, and all of them I loved. I was a weird kid, always collecting bug shells, pebbles, leaves, and bones I found in the woods, and every time we looked somewhere, I found more and more exciting bits of nature. In the end, we settled on one hilly square with an extinct spring in the very back. We had to rent a small place a few miles away while we cleared the land ourselves. After a few years, we had enough money to build a small house on the side of the largest hill. The location was better for costs, apparently. In the middle of the woods, our closest neighbors were about a mile away, and I was in heaven. I spent entire days exploring the woods, talking to plants, and playing with spiders and beetles. I told you I was weird. I was halfway through high school when things became different. It started when we had a bad flood after several heavy storms. While walking around and fixing our fence, we found something amazing. A black stone tool, which, after some research, turned out to be over 10,000 years old. The entire family became so intrigued that we began researching everything we could about the natives in the region. We went to the nearest university and talked to researchers about what the area used to look like and how ancient peoples might have lived. Meanwhile, no one noticed that the extinct spring in the back suddenly came back to life and was flowing, weak but still flowing. We learned that our area was once a string of ponds and lakes that the natives used as a sort of stepping stone between their winter and summer hunting grounds. Some people about 10 miles from us discovered a full canoe and some tools that were now at the university, but nothing major had been found too near us. Fast forward to about 2 years ago. The trickling spring has become a small pond and is filled with frogs, birds, and fish, all things I absolutely love to talk to and watch. Our new garden is thriving, and so are the populations of deer and birds in the area. Our visits to the university led us to the genealogy department and some information on several groups of native peoples, one of which had several members of our family tree. Some new neighbors have also moved in across the street from us, but within a week, they are already causing trouble. By the end of their first year here, they had been visited by the police several times, with members constantly in and out of jail on drug and petty theft charges. One night, I was woken up by terrible nightmares about fighting, screaming, blood, and gore. I sat up in bed and just couldn't get back to sleep. That's when I noticed lights and strange noises beyond the tree line. I was too afraid to go outside, but in the morning, we all went out to investigate. We were horrified. What the neighbors had dug up was a burial mound. We never figured out why they did it or if they even knew what it was at the time, because we had no idea they were there. We called the university, on the advice of the officer who took our report, and several people came out. As it turns out, the woods where I had played contained 7 Native American burial mounds, the closest being about 75 feet from our front door, at the very top of the hill. The university staff mapped our property and much of the area around us. As it turns out, several game trails, believed to be as old and unchanged as the mounds, cross our property, making the hill we built on the side of it an important spiritual place for the natives. My parents have promised not to do anything more to the land and have already willed the entire property to the university after contacting several tribes still living in the state. To learn more about the decedents of the people that once lived here, we had the university put us in touch with a historian, who also happened to be her tribe's medicine woman. We asked her to perform some rituals around the disturbed mound and the property. She told us that the actions we took immediately after the incident would have pleased the spirits and that they were already very happy. She explained that the spring coming back and the crops and wildlife doing so well were all signs that the spirits were happy, or at least fine with us living on the side of their hill. A few months went by, and everything was wonderful, except I kept having terrible dreams. Terror, anger, sorrow, and pain became my nighttime routine. And then we started hearing things. Not bumps in the night, but rumors about our destructive neighbors. They had an electrical fire, and their roof was knocked in by a giant oak during a windstorm. Their cars all began breaking down, their dogs would bark and howl all night, their cats behaved aggressively, and lots of other strange, awful things happened. They began fighting constantly with each other, and it seemed like the police were there every week. One day, however, the police came to our house instead, asking if we knew what had happened. We had no idea that the oldest son had suddenly become violent and then attacked and killed his father. The entire family ended up in jail or prison, the oldest son for murder, the younger kids for grand theft auto, and the mother for heroin. All were discovered when the police entered the home to investigate the attack. It was about this time that my nightmares stopped. A few months ago, I got into contact with some of the university researchers to see if they had found anything new in the area. The professor I talked to became very quiet, then insisted I come in for a visit. When I got there, he was in the middle of a class, so I waited in his office. After a little while, he poked his head in and, panting, motioned for me to follow. I had to run to keep up with him as we swept across the campus to the lab. Once inside, he unlocked a heavy door, then punched in a passcode for another. Inside, we found a large room full of locked cabinets. This was already becoming a little creepy, and a single padlocked door in the back. As we moved through this door, he explained that only 2 people could access this area. Inside, he unlocked a large cabinet, revealing a rectangular box about 2 feet long. He carefully carried the box to a nearby table and opened it. My stomach dropped, and my hands went cold. My heart pounded so loudly in my ears that I didn't hear what the professor had asked me. "Do you know what this is?" he repeated excitedly. I couldn't speak. I could hardly breathe. "This," he was practically glowing, "is a ceremonial short spear. The wood and sinew are even intact, and we tested them." I tried to swallow the knot in my throat as sweat trickled down my spine. "The dating results came back just before you called me yesterday. It's only 1,200 years old. Can you believe that?" He continued talking, sometimes gesturing dramatically, sometimes letting his hands hover over the box as if it contained a fragile infant. Finally, I reached out, stretching my fingers towards the spear, as a voice inside of me screamed to turn and run. "This is," I mumbled. "Yes. This is the one from the mound on your property." He beamed at me. I reached into the box and picked up the slip of paper inside. It was an evidence card. I stepped closer, and the professor clicked on a lamp. "Isn't it magnificent? The etching is sublime, though this whole section is contaminated, thanks to that boy and his father, but the flint is incredibly rare for the time and region. We could possibly trace this to a particular family group, maybe even an individual. Once we have access to the rest of the mound, of course." He sounded like he was underwater. I just stared at the spear. It was stained a dark brown from the tip to halfway down the handle. It had been bright red in my nightmares, but the stain was exactly the same, even the little splatter at the very end. I turned and walked out, leaving him still talking animatedly in the little room. I left the campus and started to drive home, but an hour later, I realized I was going the wrong way. In fact, I had gotten on the highway and headed south. Suddenly, I knew exactly where I needed to go. After another 2 hours, I had navigated nearly 20 miles of back roads and pulled up to a small shack sitting in the middle of a field. The medicine woman we had contacted before met me on the small porch. Before she could ask, I had burst into tears, telling her about my dreams and the spear. She sat quietly for a while, holding my hand. That spear was ceremonial, a powerful gift of respect and goodwill. What that boy did, disturbing the grave, stealing from the dead. I'm not surprised. I believe you dreamed about the things he saw in his head, and you may have dreamed about what he actually did. But those spirits were never angry with you, and I do not think they meant to punish you along with the boy and his terrible family. My mind spun out of control, trying to piece all of this together. But why did I even dream of those things? You are descended from an Indian. You communicate with nature like one, and you never disrespected the land or the burial mounds. You were connected to that place and therefore to those dreams before you were even born. What will happen to the rest of that family now? I don't know. But if you like, I can come by and speak with the spirits. They may be ready to rest now. She did come by and perform several ceremonies, asking our family to join in. The house across the street got cleaned up and is already being rented by a military family. So far, They think this is the best place they have ever lived. The kids play outside all the time, and the youngest is a little girl that the parents describe as weird. She talks to plants as if they were people, and she likes to play with anything that has 4 or more legs. She especially loves the strange little mounds in our woods and is always decorating them with leaves, pebbles, and shiny beetle shells. I was woken up out of a sound sleep by my husband. He was actually shaking me and yelling in my face that our 14-year-old son was drunk and was going to choke to death on his own vomit if I let him lay down. I sat up, yelling for everyone to leave our garage and not come back before climbing out of bed and heading there. Some older boys had brought beer from their home and let him drink. I'm still angry about it. My son was begging me to let him go, lay down, and sleep, but I wouldn't let him. Within a minute, he was sick all over himself and talked through it all, unaware that he was doing it. The next day, he apologized and asked me how I knew he was drinking. I told him that his dad woke me up to warn me. He turned pale and apologized again. My husband/or dad had died 2 years earlier from a sudden asthma attack. I was born in a North African country. I left it for studies, but my family is still living there. Historically speaking, King Solomon had a fight with demons, and after winning, he sent them to my country, or at least in the region where I was living, as a punishment and reclusion, so the place has the reputation of being a very active paranormal place, especially when it comes to witchcraft and black magic. We are talking about a territory of more than 800,000 square kilometers. So basically, the whole country is a nest of paranormal activities. I was in my late teenage years, maybe 18 or 19 years old, I cannot recall this. We are living in a mansion house with 3 floors and 300 square meters, so I'll let you imagine how big the thing is. My parents bought the field and constructed the house for almost 3 years, and during the construction, they found a water well with more than 3 water sources. This was not suspicious when you look closely at this detail. Spirits and demons are always looking for a source of conduction, and water seems to be a very good source to them. Anyways, long story short, one cold January night, I was chilling on my Xbox 360, on the 2nd floor, while my parents were in the basement, sleeping deeply, as this place of the house is always the warmest during winter nights and I wanted to stay alone in order to profit from my long gaming nights. I remember that I was completely sober, no lust for sleeping, I was not tired. And as a person, I was always fascinated with the invisible world, but not scared at all. As a Muslim, my religion taught me to stay strong against the invisible world and understand that each being has its own life and its own perception of living. But at the time, I was too young and had never experienced anything of the sort. After 6 hours straight of playing Street Fighter and FIFA, I decided that my eyes were deserving some rest. So I went to the toilet in front of my room and left the door half open when I came back. I was preparing myself to lay on the pillow when I heard the sound of the door opening. I thought at first that it was an aftermath of me just moving quickly and impacting the door. But when I looked at the door, and in what seemed to me like an eternity, I saw a woman. I couldn't see what she looked like, no eyes, shape, or color, just a woman with long blood-red hair and a white dress standing in front of me. With some reflection, I think she stayed for like 3 seconds before coming inside, sitting in the bed next to me. There were 2 beds because my cousin used to come over a lot, and telling me in a nice voice, "You've got a lot of dead people in this house." It may seem nice in English, but in my local language, I can assure you that it's one of the creepiest things you may ever hear. I jumped out of bed and ran straight to the basement. I woke my parents up and told them what happened. My father took a tire changing tool, don't ask me why, lol, and went to my bed to check if she was still there, and my mother was so calm that I thought that I was crazy. It turned out that she knew exactly what happened to me and didn't want to overreact. I am 27 years old now. I left my parents' house 2 years ago, and from that day on, I was never allowed to sleep alone in that room. 3 years ago, a friend of my sister, a medium, came for a visit and told us that the house looked like a demons and spirits hotel. We still don't know what to do, and I'm glad that I am not living in this house anymore. Because what I told you now is only the most notable event that happened. Other things like footsteps, noises, nightmares, things changing places randomly, and side-eye shadows are normal to me now. I've been lucky enough to have a pretty wide range of paranormal experiences over the years, but one sticks out because it involves so many people. I was at a summer camp near Madison, Wisconsin, in July of 2001. For reference, Blink-182's Take Off Your Pants and Jacket had just come out, and me and the boys were stoked on it. There were about 60 kids ages 12 to 17 and at least 8 adults around a campfire one evening at around 9:30 p.m. listening to the camp director give a little speech when the person next to me nudges me and tells me to look up. I look up to see 3 very bright lights in a triangle formation above us. There is no discernible shape, just 3 very bright lights. It must have been a mile up, at least. We watch for a second, then shrug it off and go back to listening to the director. A few minutes later, they nudge me again, and we look up to see the lights spinning around a central point. No sound, still no discernible shapes, just spinning around at a decent rate. This attracts the attention of the rest of the group, and pretty soon the whole camp is watching the lights above us. The director is watching as well, but after a few minutes, he tries to get everyone's attention focused back on them. While they are speaking, we hear a massive boom, and on the horizon, we see that jets have been scrambled and have just broken the sound barrier. It is illegal to do so over the continental US, I believe. I had never seen jets with their afterburners on before. These 5 jets lit up the night sky with the glow of those afterburners. It looked like the sunset in that corner of the sky. So these jets are inching along towards us and the lights above, it looks like they're crawling across the sky for what seems like eternity. After they get close-ish to our location and the lights just zip off into space. It's hard to convey the speed at which they exited, but it was incredible. It looks similar to the streak of light when hyperspace travel is depicted in sci-fi films, which probably doesn't lend credence to the story, but that's exactly how fast they noped out of there. So the planes continue on their path and fly directly above us. And after a few minutes of everyone being extremely excited or nervous, the camp staff told us to go inside our cabins, lock the doors, and turn off all lights. The adults were upset and not at all in the same excited mood as the kids. The next day, they had each one of us sit down one-on-one with the camp director and tell them about any disturbing thoughts, dreams, or occurrences that took place that night, which we all thought were just adults being weird. The strangest part is that I still know at least a dozen of the people who were there that night, and out of all of them, only a handful have any memory of this happening. The camp director was my best friend's, at the time, dad. I have asked him several times over the years about it, and he never fails to get really weird and standoffish whenever I bring it up. Anyway, I'd be curious if anyone from the Madison area circa summer '01 remembers the sound barrier being broken, because that is not an everyday occurrence by any means. When I was a little kid, I went to a place with my family that was said to be the site of a former group of devil worshippers, and that place was incredibly haunted. Those kinds of things always pulled me in, even as an elementary school kid, for some reason. I was in the caves, separated from my family since I was just exploring around, when I got to this one area with a narrow hallway, which I just went through until I looked up and saw something in the hole in the ceiling. It had a black robe or cloak, and I couldn't see its face, but it did have a bony arm that seemed to be coming closer, as if it were trying to touch me. I, being a smart little human, ran away looking for my parents. It was a scary experience, but since I was little, I had just recently thought I had hallucinated or something until a little while ago. I was on the street at around 2 or 3 a.m. with a friend eating food and talking when we turned a corner into a street with a roundabout, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw a slouched figure, too weird to be human for reasons I can't explain, out of the corner of my eye. It was cloaked head to toe in material darker than the night and had a weird gait to it. I stopped walking and calmly told my friend to look, and she saw the same thing. As soon as we both realized how creepy it was, the thing snapped up and turned to look at us straight in the eye with glowing white eyes. Nothing else was visible, and the cloak seemed to cover everything and was still the darkest thing I had ever seen. My friend started running, so I did too. We got a feeling that the thing was hostile, but a few seconds later we agreed to go back to see what it was. Nothing was there anymore. Yeah, I know it could have run away, but it was in the middle of a roundabout that was covered in plants and rocks, so we would have had to hear a noise. And even if it did make it out, we should have still seen it, as the area was just a meadow with a line of houses next to us that it couldn't have escaped to. With a little courage, we decided to go into the roundabout, and it was noisy and complicated to even get into, much less get out. In just a few seconds, it had evaporated into thin air, and even with a few investigations we and our friends have done, that's the only valid conclusion we have. We still don't know what it is, but we have a few guesses. The day before the incident, I visited an ancient cathedral with a bunch of dead and sacred bodies, so I think that's a little important and not really a coincidence. Also, the area is known to have a lot of stories of ghosts, possessions, and all that crap, especially at night. Some teens were partying under a train station on that street. The train station has an underground tunnel to get from side to side, since lots of people keep getting run over for weird reasons like coughing or coughing. When the whole thing started vibrating and a deep, deep voice said, "Get out." Also, a friend's grandmother has told us all to stay away from that area at night and to never go alone, as strange things happen. In 2012, I moved into a small duplex with my girlfriend. She had been living in the upstairs of this duplex for about 6 months prior to my moving in with her. The upstairs was a very small one-bedroom apartment, and the downstairs was gutted to the frame except for the back room, which was a finished laundry room. Our landlord was nice enough to let us use it to do our laundry. Before completely moving into the upstairs apartment with her, I had stayed the night there with her maybe a dozen times or so. She had a small twin-size bed, which made it pretty awkward for us to both sleep on it together, but we did it anyway. It was either the second or third time I was staying the night with her. I noticed the bed would be gently shaking, as if someone were gently pushing on the mattress, while we were trying to fall asleep. I asked her if she noticed it, and she replied that she did. I kind of just brushed it off as my heartbeat made the bed vibrate, and then I went to sleep. So about a month or so later, I end up moving in with her. We switch out her twin-size bed for my full-size bed, along with my coffee table, couch, and TV for the living room. Even after bringing my new bed there, we still felt the bed shake every now and then. So after moving in, I started to notice more weird things happening after a few weeks. There were 3 different times we were downstairs doing laundry, and we heard footsteps going up each individual step into our apartment. The stairway leading upstairs was directly in the middle of the house, and you could see the stairs as the walls were gutted downstairs. She worked a morning shift job and was usually in bed by 11 p.m. I worked a second shift job and would stay up until 3 a.m. or 4 a.m. Many times at night I would be sitting in our living room watching TV or playing video games, and out of nowhere I would get an uneasy feeling as if I were being watched. I would get goosebumps all over my body, and all of my hairs on my neck would stand up. The feeling would last maybe 5 minutes, and as quickly as the feeling came on, it would go away. This would happen at least 2 to 3 times every week. After living with her for about 6 months, things gradually seemed to happen more. We would hear footsteps more often. I would feel like I'm being watched more often. The bed would gently shake literally every night, just minutes after lying down in it. I was always skeptical about the paranormal, and I always tried to come up with a rational explanation for what we were experiencing. Then came the night that absolutely shook me to my core and made me a believer. It was about 10 p.m., and she had just left to go out with some friends about 5 minutes prior. I'm sitting in the living room scrolling through internet, and the TV is off. It's dead silent throughout the upstairs. I hear the bottom door open and shut, and then I hear someone walking up the stairs to our apartment. I thought it was her coming back because she may have forgotten her wallet, phone, or something. At the top of the stairs, there is another door that opens directly into our apartment. On the outside of the door was a Christmas ornament hanging on the door that we never took down, and every time the door opened, it would sway against the door and make noise. So I hear footsteps come all the way up to the door, I hear the doorknob turn, and I hear the ornament start swaying against the door as if someone had just entered the apartment. I walk around the corner to greet her at the door, and there is absolutely nobody there. The door was shut. I looked into the bedroom and bathroom, and there's nobody. So I open the door and look downstairs, and there is absolutely no one. I spent the next 30 minutes or so in complete disbelief at what I had just experienced. I tried to come up with a rational explanation, but I just couldn't. And then I put all of the pieces together and decided that paranormal activities are a real thing and that this house has some type of activity going on. So she gets back home around 2 a.m., and I tell her what happened and ask her what the hell is going on here. She comes clean and tells me about a bunch of things she experienced living there by herself before I moved in. She said that she would shower with the shower curtain completely open and would just put towels down on the floor so it didn't get wet, because if she showered with the curtain closed, she felt like someone was standing right outside the shower curtain every time. She said she felt like she wasn't alone in the house plenty of times, had the same feelings of being watched, and would feel the bed shake at night as well. She didn't want to bring any of it up to me before moving in because she didn't know how I would respond. We ended up moving out about 6 months later because she became pregnant and we needed a bigger place to stay. Fast forward to 2 years later, and one of my friend's sisters moves into the same apartment. I had never told my friend about any of the experiences I had there. I was over visiting them about a month after she moved in, and I told her that I had lived here about 2 years ago. She proceeds to ask me if I ever experienced anything while living there. I smirk a little and ask her, "Do you feel the bed shake at night?" I'll never forget the look on her face as she says, "Yes, oh my God." We proceeded to talk about the different things we had both experienced, and she goes on to tell me that her 3-year-old son would randomly be talking to someone who wasn't there, and they said it's a little girl. She also told me that she would get the feeling of being watched quite often as well. I have lived in almost 10 different apartments and houses in the last 15 years, and I've never experienced anything like that in any of them except for that one duplex. It 100% made me a believer. I experienced it 3 times in my life. Believe it or not, I'm not a religious person, nor do I have these beliefs in mind to start with. I'm always in doubt until I experience it on my own. My first ever experience was at 14 years old. I lived in the countryside of Japan at the time and stayed in my stepmother's family house. It was a very old wooden house, and on the second floor, you could hear the sound when someone walked around. One day, I had to stay there alone for a few days. On my first night, I heard someone walking up the stairs at midnight, and on my second night, someone ran around on the second floor. I checked on it both nights but couldn't see anything. At that time, I thought to myself that because the house was old and I was alone, maybe it made all that sound, but I couldn't hear it when other people were in the house. My second experience was when I visited and stayed in my friend's cottage during the summer break close to Algonquin, Canada. I stayed there a few weeks with a bunch of kids and my two other friends, basically babysitting friends, brother and sister at that point, and in the evening they were out playing tag, and I was always out checking for them because forest is right next to it. This one particular evening, one kid went onto the forest, and I had to go in after him. After about 5 minutes of chasing and looking for him, I found him standing still in the middle of the forest. I went in and asked if everything was alright, and he told me, "There are a group of people in a bear suit here." At first, I didn't think of anything because Algonquin Park has people go hiking all the time. But it seemed to trouble him, so I asked him again, "What does a bear suit look like?" As I carried him back, he then pointed behind my back, and I suddenly felt hot, like something was blocking the wind behind me. I turned around to look, and the forest somehow felt darker and strangely quiet, like all the wind sounds had completely stopped. Then came the whisper-like sound of a human talking, not English or French, from that direction, but nobody was there. The forest is not dense, mind you. Part of me wants to stand there and wait to see what's going on, but I ran out with that kid in my arm like a bear was chasing me instead. I never know what I experienced, but that kid claimed he saw a group of people in a bearskin suit with a club and bow. I still wonder what group of people went hiking with that equipment. Algonquin is a place with wildlife as well, but I don't think hunting is ever allowed there. My last experience was when I went on vacation in the south of Thailand just a few years ago. A Thai friend let me rent his house. He did not stay with us, that was close to the beach but very isolated from town or people. I stayed there with another friend, and on our fourth night, we headed back from the town at midnight. My friend was wasted, but I am pretty sober. As I arrived at the house, I noticed a lady on the balcony of the second floor. I came in and carried my friend to his bedroom on the second floor. I looked out to the balcony to see it locked up, so I rested my friend close to the stairs and went on to check if someone was out there. I saw nobody, and the door to the balcony was still locked tight. I was confused and started to be paranoid that someone else might be inside. The next day in the afternoon, my friend then asked awkwardly, "Who is that girl you bought back with?" He claimed to have seen a girl walk down the stairs as I went to the balcony. Long story short, we looked at each other and decided to move out of town to a hotel or motel that evening. I never talk about it to my friends ever again, but it is still on my mind to this day. What I experienced could be something normal that I couldn't explain. However, in those moments, the confusion, paranoia, and fear of the unexplainable kicked in, and I could pretty much assume things on my own. Still, it was an experience that I will never forget, and it made me believe in things that couldn't be explained. Okay, so it started last year before Dad's. We figured they were reapers. This happened 3 or 4 months before his death. Me and my sister, kept seeing these guys in black suits with a red tie, a black dress shirt, and a hat with a red band around it. He wore sunglasses and had a suitcase. As the months go on, we see him, the suit guy, around for a second, then he vanishes. We continued until about 2 weeks before Dad died. Because it was the first time we got milkshakes and chocolate from McDonald's. We ordered, and in the drive-thru, we were waiting in the car pull-up window. Just before the lady came with the food, I saw someone standing by the driver's side window, and he begged down to look in the car and smiled at me. I was about to say something to him, but he vanished in front of my eyes. It was weird when he vanished. I looked at my sister as the lady gave her the food and tried to give it to me, but I'm stunned by what just happened. After Dad's death, we didn't see it again. It was weird. What do you guys think? It was. Paranormal activity on Mount Ranch. This happened on a ranch that my brother and I lease in eastern Montana. The ranch in question is massive, covering about 18 sections. A section is 1 square mile, or 640 acres, and is 2/3 deeded, with the rest being either BLM or state-owned. This land is incredibly rugged, being covered in clay hills and deep canyons, and is for the most part unfenced. There are several buffalo jumps on the ranch, where hundreds of years ago the Indians would chase herds of buffalo off cliffs to their deaths. You can still find buffalo bones at these sites. Supposedly the ranch was also the site of a massacre, where an entire village of Hidatsa was killed by their enemies, the Sioux, although I haven't found any actual records of that incident. Also on the ranch are 2 abandoned homesteads, Mint Place and Carter Place. These are fake names as the families still live in the area and I would like to keep their information private. The Mint homestead is merely 1 mile off of a county road and relatively easy to access, so my brother and I still use the dated cattle pens that are a part of it. The Carter Place is more remote, however, only being accessible on horseback as the trail that went to it washed out many years ago. All that is left of the Carter Place is a log cabin with the roof caving in, an old corral system, and a barn that has toppled over. The last people that lived in the Carter house were the Carter family themselves, but during the 1930s, the father went crazy and murdered the entire family before turning the gun on himself. At least that's what people said. The ranch's current owners live in California and have owned the ranch since purchasing it from the Mint family sometime during the 1980s. My brother and I began leasing the ranch in 2007. There was some unusual activity at first, mainly random lights, but nothing that couldn't be explained in a reasonable way. The strangeness began in 2017 after a well was drilled on the property. I wonder now if this may have unleashed something. During the fall of 2017, I was searching for stray animals on horseback when I was approached by 2 frantic hunters. These hunters claimed that they were being stalked by a pack of wolves, but I was dismissive, as there had not been a wolf in this area since the 1920s. The hunters claimed that they knew the difference between wolves and coyotes and were absolutely certain that what was stalking them was a wolf. Whatever it was, it seriously bothered them. Later in the year, when we were trucking cattle away from the ranch and back to the home place, we found out that we were a dozen heads short. Despite us running 600 cattle on the property, we kept very close tabs on the herd, and it was unusual to lose more than 2. But no matter how many times we searched and recounted, we could not find the missing cattle. This began a trend, and so far since 2017, there have been a total of 138 unaccounted cattle, a financial loss of $165,000. Though there are many odd events that I could recount, there is one that stands out. This took place in October of 2020. Myself, my brother, and my brother's eldest son were gathering the cattle and herding them to the Mint homestead, where they could be loaded on trucks and taken to our home ranch for the winter. By this point, the weird activity on the ranch had increased, so much so that we never went to the ranch without being armed. This day was no exception, and strapped to the saddle under my left leg was a Winchester 30-30 rifle. The morning went well, and by noon we had gathered 200 heads, which we penned up at the Mint place. After eating a quick lunch, my brother and nephew loaded their horses and left. My nephew had a football game later that day. I stayed alone and rode northwest toward the Carter homestead. The first strange thing to happen was when I rode down a canyon. As I was riding, I could hear multiple howls and cries coming from all directions. I cannot describe what these howls sounded like, because they were like nothing I had heard before or since. As I continued riding in the canyon, I was overcome with a feeling of dread. My horse, Ace, seemed to pick up on this as well and began spooking at almost every shadow. This was very out of character for him, as he was usually a very calm and collected horse. The second strange thing was when I approached the Carter homestead. As I crested a hill in front of it, something jumped out of the old log cabin and ran in the opposite direction. I was still close to a mile away, so I had to use my binoculars to get a better look. What I saw through the lenses chilled me to the bone. It was a wolf, but it was massive and solid black. It was so large that it could be mistaken for a black bear, but it was undeniably canine. After seeing the wolf, my gut told me to turn around and come back later with company, but I ultimately continued. Throughout the course of the afternoon, I managed to convince myself that the wolf I saw was nothing more than a coyote and that its black fur was just a shadow. It was nearing dusk before I arrived back at the Mint place, herding 30 heads of cattle in front of me. After I penned the cattle up, I led Ace back to my pickup and horse trailer. From a distance, I could see there was something wrong with the trailer, and as I approached, I found that the axle had come apart. It didn't make any sense to me, as it was fine when I drove in, and there was no explanation as to what could have made it come apart when it wasn't moving. By this time, it was fairly dark outside, and as we were coming out the next day, I decided to unhook the trailer and leave Ace at the corrals overnight. When I left, I saw 3 blue lights near the corrals, but I attributed these lights to hunters, so I continued driving. I also heard some more of the howls I had heard earlier in the day. When all 3 of us arrived the next morning, we found the corrals in a total mess. All the grass was turned up inside the corrals where the cattle had been milling, and the fence was broken in several places. The cattle that were penned up the night before were nowhere to be found, along with Ace. My brother and nephew took off on horseback to try to locate some of the cattle and Ace, but only managed to find around 20 heads. As I was without a horse, we repaired the trailer and left later in the afternoon. The next day, all three of us rode, and we searched exclusively for Ace. During this time, I covered a lot of countries that I would have otherwise missed, and I discovered more bizarre things. At the bottom of one canyon were hundreds of holes, about 1 foot in diameter and 3 feet deep. These holes had to have been dug by people, as there would be no animal that would have dug them. I also found a bone pile, which was exceptionally strange. There were the carcasses of 4 cows, all piled on top of each other, in an area that they typically would not have accessed. At first, I thought that this was the act of poachers who were illegally killing and butchering cattle at the ranch, but there would have been no way to get to this location with a pickup or a four-wheeler, for that matter. The more we searched, the less sense everything made. We searched for 3 days before we came across something. My brother radioed me, as there was no cell service, that he believed he had found Ace. My nephew and I rode to his location, and sure enough, at the bottom of a sinkhole, sinkholes are very common in this area, so its presence was not unusual, was the carcass of Ace, along with 3 cows. The sinkhole was at the bottom of a canyon, with the walls of this canyon being 300 feet tall and the sinkhole being another 20 feet deep. It took an hour just to climb down the canyon walls. When I finally approached the sinkhole, I found Ace to be heavily mutilated. Both ears were removed, along with the eyes, nostrils, and hooves. The back half of him was not exposed, but it looked like his tail was also removed. The cows surrounding him also had similar mutilations. As was the case with the howls, the wolf, and the trailer, none of this made sense. It would have been almost impossible for just 1 cow to end up in this location, let alone 3 cows and a horse. There were also no tracks leading into or out of the sinkhole or canyon. The sheriff and veterinarian were both notified, and an investigation was launched. The ultimate conclusion was that something had caused the cattle to spook and break out of the corrals, and whatever it was spooked them so badly that they ran all the way from Mint Place to the bottom of the sinkhole, where they perished. When I mentioned the wolf I had seen, they were dismissive, just as I had been when the hunters told me of the wolf 3 years prior. No foul play was suspected, and the case was closed. Though there were many strange things that have happened since then, none were as upsetting as the loss of my horse. Cattle continued to go missing, and we now only ride the place in pairs. My brother and I are thinking about terminating the lease as, for the moment, the current cattle losses are unsustainable.